Marvel. Start with Betty Ross as my girlfriend. Chapter 1. Muffled thunder came from the edge of the sky. People walking quickly in the rainy night didn't even look up, so hardly anyone noticed that a brilliant and vast seven-colored rainbow was rapidly approaching Earth from the depths of the endless, distant starry sky. Joe Young only felt a dazzling light flash before his eyes, and his entire body was already within a passage of countless colorful rainbow lights, moving involuntarily towards a certain direction. At the same time, a huge pressure weighed down on him, making him unable to move at all. If his physical fitness hadn't improved significantly during these years in Jotunheim, he might not have been able to withstand this pressure and would have been crushed by the endless power of the universe long ago. He didn't even have time to marvel at the beauty of the Rainbow Bridge before, the next moment, he was directly thrown out of the Rainbow Bridge. Bang! He was thrown onto the solid ground. In an instant, he felt as if he had been hit hard by a truck, his whole body aching immensely. Heimdall, what the hell are you doing? Joe Young suddenly jumped up from the ground, unable to help but curse fiercely at the night sky above his head. He didn't care about the heavy rain pouring down from the sky, fiercely beating down on him. To be honest, who wouldn't be angry if this happened to them? Joe Young was doing just fine in Jotunheim. A batch of plants he had recently cultivated had just sprouted when Heimdall threw him back to Earth again. Why again? Because Joe Young himself was thrown from Earth to Jotunheim by Heimdall. There was nothing he could do, it was his fault for picking up the cosmic cube. It was already the late World War II at that time. Because Joe Young had tampered with Red Skull's plane, after his plane crashed along with Captain America Rogers, he quickly found that plane in the Arctic. Following the plane's flight path back, he finally captured the radiation pattern of gamma rays and accurately located the cosmic cube. Just as he was trying to retrieve the cosmic cube suddenly emitted a brilliant deep blue light, instantly enveloping his entire body. The next moment, when he could see his surroundings clearly again, he had been sent to the icy and snowy Jotunheim. The main reason Joe Young was able to survive in Jotunheim without being devoured alive by the frost giants was that the magic power he possessed could, to a certain extent, promote plant growth. This ability is extremely rare, especially in Jotunheim. In the icy and snowy environment of Jotunheim, the frost giants could only obtain food by fishing for fish hundreds of meters beneath the ice layer, and over the years, the number of fish available for fishing beneath the ice layer has become increasingly scarce. While it's not enough to cause a food crisis for the frost giants of Jotunheim, their living conditions are far worse than before, and if this continues, they might really run out of food someday. This doesn't mean that the fish in Jotunheim are truly extinct, but because they lost the ancient winter coffin, the frost giants lost the ability to regulate the natural environment of Jotunheim, making their survival ability worse and worse. Joe Young seems to possess only the ability to make plants grow quickly, but in the eyes of King Laufey of the Frost Giants, isn't this a weakened version of the ability to regulate the natural environment? That's why he was able to survive in Jotunheim. All of this was caused by Heimdall. Or rather, it was Odin standing behind Heimdall. Don't look at the cosmic cube just being placed on Earth like that. For many years, it has been under Heimdall's surveillance. Although Red Skull stole the cosmic cube from a church in Norway back then, he had no idea that he had been under Heimdall's surveillance all along. By the time of the final battle, he was suddenly teleported to the depths of the universe by Heimdall using the power of the cosmic cube. Even he himself eventually became a puppet of the Soul Stone, forever unable to leave that planet. Isn't this a form of retribution for him killing the priest in the church back then? After all, that church was dedicated to God King Odin. How could he lightly forgive you for killing his high priest? Joe Young was the same. At that time, he already possessed certain magic abilities, and he was studying Asgardian rune magic, which made it easier for him to be manipulated by Heimdall and then banished to Jotunheim for over half a century. Suddenly, Joe Young was teleported back to Earth just like that. If he hadn't kept the things on him by his side, always worried that other frost giants might take them, then those things might have been left behind in Jotunheim. In any case, he finally returned to Earth, and during his time in Jotunheim, his own magic made great breakthroughs, especially ice magic. In an environment like Jotunheim, he also had the permission of Laufey, King Laufey of the Frost Giants, to learn the magic of the Frost Giant wizard tribe. After decades of cultivation, Joe Young's ice magic level can be said to have improved by leaps and bounds, and his own lifespan has also been greatly extended. When he first came to this world, Joe Young always felt that he had come too early. He didn't arrive in the grand era of superheroes rising decades later. Instead, he very unfortunately came during World War II. How was he supposed to spend the nearly 70 years in between? He had even thought about freezing himself like Captain America Rogers and Winter Soldier to pass the long years, but looking at it now, his experience was no different. The raindrops constantly hitting his face quickly sobered Jo Young up. At this moment, he had finally returned to Earth. The sky above was covered with dark clouds, lightning and thunder, and heavy rain fell across the entire land, as if the whole Earth was welcoming his return with this scene. However, Jo Young couldn't help but wonder, why did Heimdall suddenly send him back to Earth? Or perhaps, behind all of this, was actually Odin. Gently shaking his head, Jo Young let out a sigh of relief. What he needed to figure out most now was the time and location he was in, so he could decide what to do next. Although he had left suddenly back then, he had left many things on Earth. If he could reclaim those things, it would definitely be a huge fortune, but he didn't know if the person in charge of that wealth was willing to return those things to him now. Just as Jo Young was about to look for a place to shelter from the rain, his steps suddenly paused, his body stiffened slightly, but he slowly turned to the right, his gaze fixed on a big tree in the distance. It looked empty there, but in reality, Jo Young knew very well that there was someone there carefully observing him using invisibility magic. An oak wand appeared in Jo Young's hand in the blink of an eye, and the magic stone at the tip suddenly shot out a white beam of light, which landed directly on that person. The invisibility magic on that person was immediately dispelled, and the person appeared directly in Jo Young's sight. He had no ill intentions. If he did, Jo Young's attempt to dispel the invisibility magic would have been directly resisted. A magician from Kamatage. Jo Young's eyebrow couldn't help but twitch. His voice was somewhat hoarse, but looking at the dark-skinned middle-aged man across from him, who was wearing monk's attire, had a shaved head, and held a long-handled wand, he quickly guessed the other party's identity. "Are you an Earthling?" The magician from Kamatage also looked at Jo Young with surprise. He hadn't expected this alien, who suddenly appeared on Earth, to not only look like an Earthling but also speak fluent English. Although it seemed a bit rusty, the other party was definitely an Earthling. "I was taken away from Earth for a while and have just been sent back." The hoarseness in Jo Young's voice gradually disappeared. "In that case, there's nothing more for me to do. My name is Daniel Drum. If you need anything, you can come find me at Bleecker Street 177A. Daniel Drum nodded at Jo Young. The next moment, the sling ring in his hand automatically spun, a dimension portal opened, and he stepped through. Immediately after, the dimension portal closed, and he had completely disappeared. Jo Young didn't relax slightly until Daniel Drum had completely left. To be honest, he really didn't want to fight with these magicians from Kamatage, especially on Earth, where he would be at a significant disadvantage. On Earth, few magicians can contend with combat magicians from Kamatage. Especially over the past 1,000 years, the magicians of Kamatage have basically stood at the pinnacle of Earth magicians. There's nothing that can be done about this. Ever since the Earth Dimension Defense Array they constructed took shape, no one has been able to surpass them. Since the battle 1,000 years ago, the magic element on Earth has become increasingly inert, which ultimately caused the magic power that magicians can unleash to become weaker and weaker. People had to rely on powerful magic items to ensure their strength. During this time, the magicians of Kamatage, who could perform arbitrary dimension teleportation to any corner of Earth relying on the Earth Dimension Defense Array, have accumulated who knows how many good things over countless years, which has made them even stronger. The entire magic world, and even the entire transcendent world on Earth, is in decline, but only the magicians of Kamatage are growing stronger day by day. This is not to say that no one has questioned and envied them, but the magicians of Kamatage used their powerful strength to silence all doubts. Of course, the reason Kamatage was not besieged by all the transcendent powers in this world is partly because their invisibility spell is very strong, and partly because of the huge responsibility they bear, facing the demons from countless dimensions who want to invade Earth. No magician wants to face such enemies. As a magician, Jo Young knows more. The strength of Kamatage is not just because of this. The Time Stone is one aspect, but more importantly, the powerful god-level magicians of the Vishanti Trinity, Agamotto, Oshtor, and Hoggoth. Therefore, under the circumstances where the other party could maximize their combat ability while his own magic ability would be greatly affected, Jo Young did not want to fight with the magician from Kamatage. The other party indeed acted as the rumors suggested, abiding by their code of conduct, always targeting enemies on the dimension level and not arbitrarily interfering in internal conflicts on Earth. Even if the entire Earth were bombed into uninhabitable land by nuclear bombs, they would never stop such a thing from happening. The invisibility spell of Kamar-Taj is very powerful, and even the Sanctum Sanctorum they built possesses the same ability. Otherwise, the IRS would have come knocking at the New York Sanctum countless times already. Ordinary people would have gone bankrupt long ago. The invisibility spell of Kamar-Taj is very powerful, but some people are different. Joe Young in the heavy rain turned his head to look at a figure hiding outside the playground fence in the distance, and chuckled softly. The next moment, before that figure could react, Joe Young had already appeared behind her. "Girl, it's not right for you to secretly peek at others like this." Joe Yang's voice appeared behind her, startling the girl greatly. She turned around abruptly, the tip of her umbrella in her hand pointed directly at Joe Young. At this moment, she couldn't care that the heavy rain had instantly soaked her clothes, and she asked nervously and tremblingly, "Who exactly are you, and what do you want to do?" "It's not what I want to do, but what you want to do, girl." As soon as Joe Young finished speaking, the umbrella in the girl's hand had fallen into Joe Yang's hand. He reopened the umbrella, covering both himself and the girl under it to avoid being soaked by the heavy rain any further. The rain today was really heavy, and coupled with the fact that it was summer and the girl was only wearing a white t-shirt, the heavy rain soaked her completely in a very short time, and her light blue underwear underneath was quite visible. However, this is America after all, and the atmosphere is quite open. The girl herself didn't care, and Joe Young didn't mind occasionally having some eye candy. Joe Yang's sudden action startled the girl greatly, one could even see her hands and skin all over her body trembling. Joe Young could only shake his head helplessly and say, "I won't hurt you, girl. Let's get to know each other. My name is Daniel Joe." It seemed that the helpless wry smile on Joe Yang's face made the girl relax her guard a little. Only then did she cautiously say, "My name is Elizabeth Ross, you can also call me Betty. You mustn't do anything funny, I'll call the police." Elizabeth Ross was clearly very curious. Although she was very wary of Joe Young, she was very curious about the exchange between Joe Young and Daniel Drum earlier and the magic they both used, especially after Tony Stark personally declared himself Iron Man not long ago. Joe Young didn't pay much attention to her attitude. Not only did Joe Young discover her just now, but Daniel Drum also discovered her. However, the other party left so easily because he believed Joe Young could handle this matter well. Joe Young looked at the girl in front of him whose clothes were almost completely soaked, who had a slender figure, beautiful appearance, and a noticeably full chest. The magic wand in his hand was just raised, and then put down again. If he were to erase her memory here at this time, who knows what would happen afterward? What if someone picked her up? "I just came back after dealing with something. Can you tell me where this is, and what month it is now? Can you find a place for me to make a call?" Joe Yang's voice carried a hint of charm. After all, it was indeed a bit difficult for her to help a stranger so much in a short time. Elizabeth Ross's eyes seemed a bit confused, but she quickly agreed readily, saying, "Okay, I still have an apartment at the school." "Thank you, Miss Deputy Director Ross." Joe Young extended the umbrella a little further, helping to cover most of Elizabeth Ross's body, and walked towards the flickering lights ahead. Joe Yang's actions made Elizabeth Ross feel a little warmth. Her sparkling eyes looked at Joe Young, who was wearing a leather robe, and said, "Actually, you can call me Betty." Of course, Joe Young was wearing a leather robe. You see, the place he stayed was Jotunheim, where the entire planet is below -60 degrees Celsius all year round, and in many places the temperature is even below -100 degrees Celsius. At the same time, the deeper into the planet's core, the lower the temperature. Joe Young even suspected that in the innermost core of the entire planet, the temperature even reached a terrifying absolute zero. In such an environment, to pass through safely without any damage, it was natural to wear clothes made of leather robes from the fur of locally produced beasts to better resist the cold. Joe Young was not like those frost giants, who could run freely in a world close to -100 degrees Celsius with bare chests. Therefore, if the layer of leather robe on his body were taken out and studied on Earth, some things could still be researched. However, wanting to persuade Joe Young to take off this layer of leather robe and hand it over would not be so easy. He smiled slightly to himself, and then said to Elizabeth Ross, "Okay, Miss Deputy Director Ross, no, it's Betty." The smile on Zhou Yang's face completely froze for a moment. There was even a hint of unimaginable coldness in it. He forced a smile from the corner of his mouth and said, "Betty Ross, but you just said your name is Elizabeth Ross." "Yes, is there a problem?" Betty Ross also seemed to notice the strangeness about Zhou Yang. She stopped, raised her eyebrows, looked at Zhou Yang, and said somewhat unhappily, "My full name is Elizabeth Talbot Ross, Elizabeth, Beth, so my parents often call me Betty too." So that was the reason. It's not wrong to say that, but how could the person in front of me be Betty Ross? If it were someone else, Zhou Yang wouldn't have such a deep impression, but Betty Ross, she is General Ross's daughter and Dr. Bruce Banner's ex-girlfriend. The moment Zhou Yang realized Betty Ross's identity, his keen mental power spread out in all directions like mercury flowing across the ground. In the blink of an eye, it had covered the entire campus. Although he also saw some indecent things, he did not find the traces of a large number of hidden troops as he had expected. He didn't even see any United States military soldiers protecting Betty Ross in secret. Zhou Yang couldn't be blamed for being too cautious. When he was in Jotunheim, although his life and death were not under great threat, the frost giants were not very friendly to him. Although he had the protection of La Fei, King La Fei of the frost giants would always come to trouble him every now and then. Perhaps because of the loss of the ancient winter coffin, although the frost giants still retained some inheritance from the frost warlocks of ancient times, not a single frost warlock survived. Therefore, within their race, the martial spirit is very strong. They looked down even more on Zhou Yang, this seemingly gentle and weak earth mage, so they would fight him every now and then. You can imagine that even if Zhou Yang had some magic abilities, fighting the frost giants in Jotunheim, his fate was simply too tragic. It was only later that his magic level continuously improved, even reaching the realm of a legendary mage, that he gained a certain ability to protect himself, making those frost giants dare not trouble him. Only then did his life become slightly more stable. Regardless, he was suddenly sent back to Earth by Odin this time. If you said there was really nothing going on, he absolutely wouldn't believe it. Heimdall probably sent him to Jotunheim back then to punish him, and now he suddenly sent him back to Earth without a word. There must be other plans involved. Zhou Yang himself cultivated Asgard's rune magic. The fact that he wasn't killed back then indicates it was just a small punishment, and now that he has been sent back to Earth, there must be other plans. If it were an ordinary person, they probably wouldn't understand the entanglement here, but Zhou Yang knew that Asgard was about to undergo a major change. In any case, facing Betty Ross in front of him, perhaps Zhou Yang was mistaken, and she was just someone with the same name as Betty Ross. But he still couldn't help but probe. Then Miss Deputy Director Ross, "No, Betty, do you know the current situation of Dr. Bruce Banner?" "Who?" Betty Ross's face was full of surprise. She asked Zhou Yang very carefully for confirmation, "Are you talking about Dr. Bruce Banner? That name sounds a bit familiar. I seem to have read an article by him in a journal in some year, but that was many years ago. In recent years, at least in the scientific community, almost no one has heard of his existence." Betty Ross really seemed not to know Dr. Bruce Banner. If she didn't know his name at all, that would definitely be abnormal, because no matter what, Dr. Banner is one of the top scientists in the world. He has published more than just one or two top-tier papers. So Betty Ross must have heard his name. As for Dr. Banner not publishing any articles in recent years, it's actually understandable. After all, he has become the Hulk, and even a brief appearance will lead to a full-scale roundup by the United States military. Is this Betty Ross in front of me really not Dr. Bruce Banner's girlfriend? Zhou Yang couldn't help but have this thought again. After all, in America, the repetition rate of encountering the same name is much higher than in the East. Some people even unceremoniously use their parents' or even grandparents' names after having sons and daughters, which is very normal. In fact, if Zhou Yang wanted to continue investigating Betty Ross's true identity, he could completely go and ask if Betty Ross's father is a general in the United States military. As long as he confirms this, he can completely confirm Betty Ross's true identity. But all of a sudden, Zhou Yang was also a little afraid and didn't dare to ask. If Betty Ross had no relationship with General Ross, then it could only be said that Zhou Yang just met someone with the same name. However, if her father was General Ross, and she herself didn't know Dr. Bruce Banner at all, then the situation would be serious. Then either Joe Young returned to a time before Betty Ross and Dr. Banner met, or there was no Bruce Banner in this world at all. The more he thought about it, the more terrifying it became. Joe Young stood in the warm bathroom. Although it was already summer, Joe Young still turned the hot water temperature to the maximum. The scalding water droplets fell on him. Not only did they not make him feel any discomfort, but they made him feel unusually comfortable. Can you imagine? He hadn't taken a hot bath in decades. Bathing in a place like Jotunheim, what would you use to bathe? Ice. In a place where the highest temperature is only -50 or 60 degrees Celsius, the water freezes into ice as soon as it appears. Only because Joe Young was a magician, he still had some ability. If it were any other profession, he would probably be covered in mud by now. However, no matter what, Joe Young's physical fitness had already been tempered in a place like Jotunheim. He had accumulated an unknown amount of ice and cold energy in his body, and it was precisely by relying on this ice and cold energy that he successfully broke through to the realm of a legendary mage. But these were all things of the past. What Joe Young was thinking about now was some information he had just obtained from Betty Ross. He had roughly figured out the time period he was in. Just over half a year ago, Tony Stark was kidnapped in Afghanistan. 1 or 2 months later, he escaped from the terrorists by himself and built his first set of steel armor. After returning to America, he also dealt with his biggest opponent, Obadiah Stane. Everything at Stark Industries was under his control, and not long ago, Stark had announced that he would hold the Stark Expo. Everything was being actively prepared, and for the time being, there had been no reports of any accidents. So, based on this information, Joe Young roughly determined his position in the historical development of the entire Marvel Universe. While in Jotunheim, there was no incident of Thor and his brothers coming to Jotunheim to fight. It wouldn't be long before Thor would be exiled to Earth. He would probably have to deal with Thor. Many things, even if Joe Young wanted to avoid them, he probably couldn't. As long as he was on Earth, no, even as long as he was within the 9 realms, he probably couldn't escape Heimdall's sight. And as long as he casually moved the Rainbow Bridge, Joe Young would likely appear in front of Thor immediately. This is very troublesome. Odin, even if you want to train your son, you don't have to use people like us as whetstones. Facing Thor, Joe Young admitted that he was far from qualified. Even in Jotunheim, he only managed to break through to the realm of a legendary magician through the ice and frost power of Jotunheim. However, after returning to Earth, although his realm did not drop, the magical power he could exert only reached the peak of an ordinary magician. Perhaps he could go head-to-head with someone like Wolverine Logan, but facing powerful beings like Charles Professor and Magneto, who could even cause the complete destruction of humanity with their full power, it was already very difficult for Joe Young to ensure his own survival. However, there were also good aspects to this. The extreme inertia of Earth's magic element, which affected Joe Young, probably also affected Thor and others. This is why people saw that the power Thor could exert on Earth was not much stronger than that of Magneto and Charles Professor. It was because he could not solve the problem of Earth's magic element being too inert. Although Thor's hammer is extremely powerful, in addition to its own power, it also needs to leverage the power of Earth's magic element for its own use. However, due to the extreme inertia of Earth's magic element, the power they can exert is not ideal. This not only applies to Thor, but also to Loki and many others, including Thanos. For Joe Young himself, he must re-establish the path to the realm of a legendary magician. He cannot say that because Earth's magic element is too inert, the magical power he can exert is strictly limited below that of a legendary magician. He must find a way. And on the entire Earth, the thing that can best help Joe Young solve this problem is the Cosmic Cube. However, that thing is not so easy to approach. It can be said that in the original timeline, the Cosmic Cube was always under the control of Asgard. Joe Young might be able to approach it, but it is basically impossible to hold it in his hand forever. So, he must think of other alternatives. For example, the Mind Stone scepter brought by Loki, or the Reality Stone which is still suppressed in the spatial rift. Perhaps when he is strong enough, he can also go deep into the universe to snatch the Power Stone. As for the Time Stone, something that already has an owner is the most difficult to snatch, but if there is a real opportunity, Joe Young would also like to try. As for other alternative solutions, they are not non-existent. For example, the superluminal engine that created Captain Marvel back then, or the arc reactor created by Tony Stark, which imitates the cosmic cube particles. These are things that can be fought for. Moreover, even now, he can find a way to get the blueprints for these two things. The secret database of S.H.I.E.L.D., Tony Stark's office, Jo Young can try. Especially in the near future, the Stark Expo is about to be held, which is a good opportunity. However, Jo Young still needs to solve the trouble outside. She is indeed Betty Ross, and she is the real Betty Ross, General Ross's daughter, and Bruce Banner's ex-girlfriend. There was a photo of her and General Ross on Betty Ross's desk. Jo Young didn't even need to confirm that it was General Ross. He could determine Betty Ross's identity just by looking at the general's military uniform she was wearing. So she is also Dr. Bruce Banner's girlfriend, or more accurately, ex-girlfriend, but she has long forgotten the existence of Dr. Banner. The reasons for this are certainly quite complex. Jo Young did not know what happened back then that caused Betty Ross to forget this memory, or perhaps it was intentionally done by Deputy Director Ross, who found someone to help him seal his daughter's memory of Dr. Bruce Banner. If it were someone else, they might not be able to tell, but Jo Young is a powerful magician after all, and spiritual power is his area of expertise. Even without close examination, Jo Young could detect the problem deep within Betty Ross's soul with just a sweep of his spiritual power. Dr. Bruce Banner has completely disappeared for several years. At least, there is no trace of him in America. If it were a few years ago, as Dr. Banner's ex-girlfriend, Betty Ross would definitely have been under the surveillance of the United States military. But now, she has completely forgotten Dr. Bruce Banner, and for her to live a peaceful life, her father no longer bothers her. Jo Young also doesn't know where Dr. Banner is now. He only knows that when S.H.I.E.L.D. found him later, Dr. Banner seemed to be in the India-Nepal area. As for whether he is still there now, it is a mystery. However, these are not the most important things for Jo Young. The most urgent thing for him right now is to solve his identity problem and also to retrieve the things he left on Earth back then. Wiping his hair, Jo Young walked out of the bathroom. At this time, on the table in the living room, Betty Ross had already prepared a shirt and shorts for Jo Young, and they were men's shirts and shorts. These are my ex-boyfriend's things. I hope you can leave as soon as possible. Betty Ross looked at the strong and tall Jo Young with a complicated expression. The cold winter had long tempered Jo Young's physique. And after he had cleaned up the beard and long hair on his face, a relatively handsome and firm face appeared before Betty Ross. Although he was not particularly handsome, he was at least quite charming, no less than her previous boyfriend. None of the men Betty Ross fell for were not handsome. Although she was somewhat moved, Betty Ross was more regretful. She even couldn't believe herself that she brought a complete stranger back to her dormitory just because of some curiosity. This was something she would not normally do. No problem, but I need to make a phone call first. Jo Young twitched the corner of his mouth. He only hoped that the phone number was still the same after all these years. Okay. Betty Ross moved aside, motioning for Jo Young to make the call, and asked, "Can I ask you a few questions?" "Go ahead." Jo Young didn't seem to mind. The main reason Betty Ross was willing to tolerate him until now was because of the fact that Jo Young could perform magic. Perhaps, even though she had forgotten the past with Dr. Bruce Banner, the idea of wanting to solve the problem with Dr. Banner was always in the deepest part of her heart. And although Betty Ross temporarily forgot Dr. Bruce Banner, she would eventually remember him one day. It's just that their future is ultimately impossible. As long as Dr. Banner is stimulated, he will transform into the Hulk. With such a huge body, how could Betty Ross endure it? Betty Ross didn't know that Jo Young had thought so much in such a short time. At this moment, she was very curious and asked directly, "Are you really a magician? Was that person just now also a magician? Can I learn magic from you?" "You are too old." Jo Young reached out and picked up the phone on the table, then raised his eyebrows and looked at Betty Ross, saying, "Can your phone here make international calls?" "No problem, go ahead." Betty Ross glared at Jo Young in annoyance. No woman likes to hear others say she is too old. Although Betty Ross knew that Jo Young was telling the truth, her slight fantasy in her heart was completely shattered. In addition, Jo Young unintentionally pointed out her age, which made Betty Ross feel a surge of depression. She couldn't help but ask, "How old are you?" "Don't think about it, much older than you." Jo Young chuckled, then withdrew his gaze and focused on the phone receiver in his hand. After dialing the last number, a beep, beep, Sound came from the phone. The call went through. Before Joe Young was taken to Jotunheim, he had many industries in America. In addition, his identity required him to hide behind the scenes, so he put a proxy in the front to manage them. It's just that Joe Young didn't contact this proxy. No one knows how she is doing now. Moreover, Joe Young also had his own hidden force in the dark, hidden on a deserted island in the Arctic Ocean. And this deserted island was also managed by someone, and both parties were aware of each other. Joe Young had been missing for so long, and no one knew how the situation had changed during this time. And the person Joe Young was contacting now was his third hidden piece, besides these two parties. This was the one he was most at ease with. It's not that this party was loyal to him, it's that he had blocked all their other paths, and they had a very intuitive understanding of Joe Yang's power. Coupled with the secrets Joe Young held, it was difficult for the other party to betray him, and most importantly, they didn't control much power. However, although they didn't control much power, their identities were very important. Especially after getting Joe Yang's support, they could even take over the other two forces again through covert infiltration methods. This was the last resort Joe Young had arranged for himself, because back in the final battle of World War II, Joe Young was worried that something might happen to him, perhaps being frozen like Captain America Rogers, or being teleported to another planet like Red Skull. So he made arrangements in advance, but he didn't expect to survive the final battle of World War II, only to be ambushed by Heimdall. The phone kept ringing, but no one answered for a long time. Joe Young knew what was going on. After all, he hadn't had any news for a long time, and it was already good that the phone was still connected. Of course, no one could be guarding it at all times. It seemed he would have to call a few more times. Joe Young put down the phone, but suddenly found that Betty Ross was gone. At this time, the sound of water splashing came from the bathroom. After all, Betty Ross had been soaked by the heavy rain before, so it was normal for her to take a bath now. It's just that Joe Young was a man, and a man who hadn't seen a woman in decades. The call finally connected. The person on the other end, with surprise, uncertainty, and even some panic, asked Joe Young about the originally set riddle. After Joe Young calmly finished the riddle, the other party quickly calmed down. After all, their family had been in the Netherlands for so many years for this very day. Joe Young did not ask the other party to rush to America immediately. Instead, after inquiring about their family's situation, he instructed them to follow the original arrangements and activate layer upon layer of measures to infiltrate the other two forces. Within those two forces, there would naturally be people to receive them. This is the most important matter at the moment. If it comes to a critical juncture, Joe Young may even need to personally step forward. However, the immediate priority is to resolve Joe Yang's identity issue, an identity that allows him to move freely in America. Although it is said that as long as one has ability, they can still live well in America, if one truly wants to integrate into this world, it is best to have an identity. As expected of the last resort Joe Young specifically left, the wealth he left behind allowed that family to develop rapidly in the Netherlands over the years. However, due to identity issues, they have always been very low-key. Although the outside world knows of the existence of such a family, they know very little about their internal situation. In fact, families that deliberately maintain such mystery are not only in the Netherlands but also in Belgium, Norway, and even England. These are families that have been passed down since before World War I. After World War I and World War II, the experience of the Jews has given them a deep lesson. Don't look at how people often say that Jews are the richest people in the world, but think about it carefully. The Jews are so rich, yet among the presidents of America, why isn't there a single Jew? Standing at the top tier of the world are still white people. Jews are merely their money bags, to be taken from as they please. Therefore, after World War II, in light of the lessons learned by the Jews, many families hid their wealth very deeply. Everything was operated behind the scenes, rarely revealed to people, which is why Joe Young had the opportunity to exploit the loophole. So, on the morning of the second day, Joe Young received a special delivery. After sending the delivery person away, he took out the contents of the package. A personal identification document, a bank card, and the key to an apartment in Manhattan. Getting so much done in one night is already quite good. Regardless, with money, everything is easy to handle. Don't look at Joe Young being a magician with powerful strength, but without money, in modern society, he will ultimately be unable to move even an inch. Moreover, the most crucial thing is that in outer space above his head, there are thousands of satellites constantly monitoring. If he really causes a big commotion, he will probably be locked onto immediately. It is now modern society, which is very different from the clean sky of his time back then. So, during these days at Imperial University, Jo Young had been searching the library for historical changes over the past few decades. The general historical trajectory of the mundane human world has not changed much. Even if there are occasional small differences, they do not have much impact on Jo Young. What he is truly concerned about are the whereabouts of various forces existing on Earth, such as S.H.I.E.L.D., Hydra, Leviathan, Captain America Rogers Invaders, as well as Fantastic Four, Spider-Man, mutants, Inhumans, Kree, Skrulls, and so on. Of course, it's ridiculous to actually expect to find all these things from the library of Imperial University. Even the most well-known S.H.I.E.L.D. is mostly hidden behind the scenes at this time, let alone organizations like Hydra and Leviathan. Even Captain America Rogers Invaders are not mentioned in the news, and replacing them are Captain America Rogers and his Howling Commandos. As for Namor, the first-generation Human Torch, Union Jack, Miss America, etc., they have long since disappeared without a trace. However, the Fantastic Four and Spider-Man were already active on the pages of various newspapers, big and small, before Stark announced he was Iron Man. In addition, there are mutants, whose threat occasionally makes it onto the pages of tabloids. It is clear that mutants have been quite silent during this period, but Jo Young knows that no matter when, mutants will not remain silent for too long. As for Inhumans, Kree, and Skrulls, perhaps in this world, people don't even know that these people are hidden on Earth. This is the general pattern of the world. The most widely reported news currently is Tony Stark's Stark Expo. Jo Young always has to visit there. No matter what he is going to do, he always has to meet with Stark, even if it's just to watch the fireworks show. In the past few days, a lot has been done in the Netherlands. Although Jo Young's personal identification document is ready, the related information needs to be supplemented. All the events this identity has experienced since childhood, and the people who have seen him and know him, must all be properly arranged. What is this? Looking at the admission notice in Jo Young's hand, Betty Ross's mouth widened in surprise. Isn't it obvious? This is the admission notice for the Department of Biological Sciences at Imperial University. I'm going to be a freshman at Imperial University soon, teacher. Jo Young reached out and picked up Betty Ross. Are you only 18 years old? Betty Ross looked at Jo Young in disbelief. The information on it clearly showed that Jo Young was born in 1990. How old am I? Don't you know, teacher? Jo Young smiled ambiguously, then lifted Betty Ross's chin and stroked it, saying, "My dear teacher, you should know that a man's age is as sensitive as a woman's age." HMPH. Betty Ross snorted disdainfully, but didn't ask any further. After all, she and Jo Young had only known each other for a few days. Even if they had some relationship now, it was only a temporary one, which is very common in America. All right, Jo Young pecked Betty Ross on the lips, then continued, "I'm moving out today. I just got an apartment ready. Let's go out and celebrate in a while." "Okay, but I have to go to the academic affairs office first. Then we can buy some cake on the way and then visit your new apartment." Betty Ross accepted everything very calmly. After all, this is the teacher's apartment, and some things are inconvenient at times. Jo Young didn't mind. Anyway, he still had to pack his things. The leather armor, leather clothes, leather pants, leather hats, and leather boots he brought back from Jotunheim were all made of beast fur. After returning to Earth, it was no longer convenient to show them to people. Moreover, he still needed to modify these things in the future, transforming them into a special magic robe. These days, he had only been wearing some simple clothes and a suit custom-made at a ready-to-wear store, which he also had to pick up today. Actually, when it comes to comfort, clothes made from Jotunheim beast fur are more comfortable. Beasts that can survive in an environment like Jotunheim are by no means simple. However, when it comes to appearance, a handmade custom-made suit from Earth fits better and makes Jo Young look more handsome. This world is ultimately a world that values appearance, otherwise, Betty Ross wouldn't have accepted him so quickly. Although such things are actually very common in America. When Jo Young walked towards Betty Ross, carrying the newly bought suitcase and wearing a custom-made brown suit, she was sitting on a campus chair, holding a coffee, and couldn't help but her eyes lit up. She subconsciously stood up and intimately hugged Jo Young. At this time, Betty Ross was wearing a light blue checkered long dress, looking very elegant and beautiful, and of course, she also smiled very sweetly. However, just as Jo Young hugged her, his entire body stiffened, and veins popped out all over him, because at this moment, he suddenly felt as if he was being stared at intently by a ferocious beast. Under a large tree in the distance, a burly man wearing a hat stared intently at the two people, a trace of green light flashing in his eyes. The call finally connected. The person on the other end, with surprise, uncertainty, and even some panic, asked Jo Young about the originally set riddle. After Jo Young calmly finished the riddle, the other party quickly calmed down. After all, their family had been in the Netherlands for so many years for this very day. Jo Young did not ask the other party to rush to America immediately. Instead, after inquiring about their family's situation, he instructed them to follow the original arrangements and activate layer upon layer of measures to infiltrate the other two forces. Within those two forces, there would naturally be people to receive them. This is the most important matter at the moment. If it comes to a critical juncture, Jo Young may even need to personally step forward. However, the immediate priority is to resolve Jo Young's identity issue, an identity that allows him to move freely in America. Although it is said that as long as one has ability, they can still live well in America, if one truly wants to integrate into this world, it is best to have an identity. As expected of the last resort Jo Young specifically left, the wealth he left behind allowed that family to develop rapidly in the Netherlands over the years. However, due to identity issues, they have always been very low-key. Although the outside world knows of the existence of such a family, they know very little about their internal situation. In fact, families that deliberately maintain such mystery are not only in the Netherlands but also in Belgium, Norway, and even England. These are families that have been passed down since before World War I. After World War I and World War II, the experience of the Jews has given them a deep lesson. Don't look at how people often say that Jews are the richest people in the world, but think about it carefully. The Jews are so rich, yet among the presidents of America, why isn't there a single Jew? Standing at the top tier of the world are still white people. Jews are merely their money bags, to be taken from as they please. Therefore, after World War II, in light of the lessons learned by the Jews, many families hid their wealth very deeply. Everything was operated behind the scenes, rarely revealed to people, which is why Jo Young had the opportunity to exploit the loophole. So, on the morning of the second day, Jo Young received a special delivery. After sending the delivery person away, he took out the contents of the package. A personal identification document, a bank card, and the key to an apartment in Manhattan. Getting so much done in one night is already quite good. Regardless, with money, everything is easy to handle. Don't look at Jo Young being a magician with powerful strength, but without money, in modern society, he will ultimately be unable to move even an inch. Moreover, the most crucial thing is that in outer space above his head, there are thousands of satellites constantly monitoring. If he really causes a big commotion, he will probably be locked onto immediately. It is now modern society, which is very different from the clean sky of his time back then. So, during these days at Imperial University, Jo Young had been searching the library for historical changes over the past few decades. The general historical trajectory of the mundane human world has not changed much. Even if there are occasional small differences, they do not have much impact on Jo Young. What he is truly concerned about are the whereabouts of various forces existing on Earth, such as S.H.I.E.L.D., Hydra, Leviathan, Captain America Rogers Invaders, as well as Fantastic Four, Spider-Man, mutants, Inhumans, Kree, Skrulls, and so on. Of course, it's ridiculous to actually expect to find all these things from the library of Imperial University. Even the most well-known S.H.I.E.L.D. is mostly hidden behind the scenes at this time, let alone organizations like Hydra and Leviathan. Even Captain America Rogers Invaders are not mentioned in the news, and replacing them are Captain America Rogers and his Howling Commandos. As for Namor, the first-generation Human Torch, Union Jack, Miss America, etc., they have long since disappeared without a trace. However, the Fantastic Four and Spider-Man were already active on the pages of various newspapers, big and small, before Stark announced he was Iron Man. In addition, there are mutants, whose threat occasionally makes it onto the pages of tabloids. It is clear that mutants have been quite silent during this period, but Jo Young knows that no matter when, mutants will not remain silent for too long. As for Inhumans, Kree, and Skrulls, perhaps in this world, people don't even know that these people are hidden on Earth. This is the general pattern of the world. The most widely reported news currently is Tony Stark's Stark Expo. Jo Young always has to visit there. No matter what he is going to do, he always has to meet with Stark, even if it's just to watch the fireworks show. In the past few days, a lot has been done in the Netherlands. Although Jo Young's personal identification document is ready, the related information needs to be supplemented. All the events this identity has experienced since childhood, and the people who have seen him and know him, must all be properly arranged. What is this? Looking at the admission notice in Jo Young's hand, Betty Ross's mouth widened in surprise. Isn't it obvious? This is the admission notice for the Department of Biological Sciences at Imperial University. I'm going to be a freshman at Imperial University soon, teacher. Jo Young reached out and picked up Betty Ross. Are you only 18 years old? Betty Ross looked at Jo Young in disbelief. The information on it clearly showed that Jo Young was born in 1990. How old am I, don't you know, teacher? Jo Young smiled ambiguously, then lifted Betty Ross's chin and stroked it, saying, my dear teacher, you should know that a man's age is as sensitive as a woman's age. HMPH. Betty Ross snorted disdainfully, but didn't ask any further. After all, she and Jo Young had only known each other for a few days. Even if they had some relationship now, it was only a temporary one, which is very common in America. All right, Jo Young pecked Betty Ross on the lips, then continued, I'm moving out today. I just got an apartment ready. Let's go out and celebrate in a while. Okay, but I have to go to the academic affairs office first. Then we can buy some cake on the way and then visit your new apartment. Betty Ross accepted everything very calmly. After all, this is the teacher's apartment, and some things are inconvenient at times. Jo Young didn't mind. Anyway, he still had to pack his things. The leather armor, leather clothes, leather pants, leather hats, and leather boots he brought back from Jotunheim were all made of beast fur. After returning to Earth, it was no longer convenient to show them to people. Moreover, he still needed to modify these things in the future, transforming them into a special magic robe. These days, he had only been wearing some simple clothes and a suit custom made at a ready-to-wear store, which he also had to pick up today. Actually, when it comes to comfort, clothes made from Jotunheim beast fur are more comfortable. Beasts that can survive in an environment like Jotunheim are by no means simple. However, when it comes to appearance, a handmade custom-made suit from Earth fits better and makes Jo Young look more handsome. This world is ultimately a world that values appearance, otherwise, Betty Ross wouldn't have accepted him so quickly. Although such things are actually very common in America. When Jo Young walked towards Betty Ross, carrying the newly bought suitcase and wearing a custom-made brown suit, she was sitting on a campus chair, holding a coffee, and couldn't help but her eyes lit up. She subconsciously stood up and intimately hugged Jo Young. At this time, Betty Ross was wearing a light blue checkered long dress, looking very elegant and beautiful, and of course, she also smiled very sweetly. However, just as Jo Young hugged her, his entire body stiffened, and veins popped out all over him, because at this moment, he suddenly felt as if he was being stared at intently by a ferocious beast. Under a large tree in the distance, a burly man wearing a hat stared intently at the two people, a trace of green light flashing in his eyes. However, the fierce gaze Daniel Joe felt quickly faded away. At this moment, Betty Ross also said to Daniel Joe in a somewhat confused tone, I think I saw someone familiar there. Letting go of Betty Ross, Daniel Joe also turned around and looked in the direction Betty Ross was looking. He only saw a leaf drifting down from the top of a tree in the shadows far away, but there was no sign of anyone. Betty Ross also saw nothing. However, Daniel Joe's powerful mental strength allowed him to see further. Around the corner of a distant building, a figure was leaving in a hurry. That person contained extremely powerful and terrifying strength, even though he looked so ordinary at the moment. Dr. Bruce Banner, who had been missing for a long time, even to the point where Betty Ross had completely forgotten him, suddenly appeared here today, making Daniel Joe sigh. If Daniel Joe remembered correctly, Dr. Bruce Banner's future romantic world only included Natasha Romanoff. Only she could control the Hulk after he transformed, and Banner and Betty Ross had no future together at all. Let's go buy a cake. Daniel Joe brought over Betty Ross, whose gaze was still fixed on the distance, and walked towards outside the school with a smile. Betty Ross didn't really find anything. she just took a couple more glances and then walked outside with Daniel Joe. Actually, during this time, Betty Ross and Daniel Joe talked more about the world of magic. Although Betty Ross couldn't cultivate magic, she was very interested in everything about the magic world. Of course, Daniel Joe couldn't tell her the truth, but he slightly modified it and told her about the structure of the 9 realms. In Daniel Joe's description, the 9 realms were still centered around Earth. Besides Earth, high above was the realm of the gods, and at the bottom was Hell. In addition, there were several major elemental worlds: the world of light, the world of darkness, the world of fire, the world of ice, and also the world of elves and the world of dwarves. The realm of the gods corresponds to Asgard, Hell corresponds to Hell, the world of light corresponds to Vanaheim, the world of darkness corresponds to Svartalheim, the world of fire corresponds to Muspelheim, the world of ice corresponds to Jotunheim, elves live in Alfheim, and dwarves live in Nidavellir. However, Daniel Joe described the giants of these 9 realms as elemental life forms, elves, dwarves, and gods. To some extent, there was no big problem. After all, the giants of the 9 realms couldn't come to Earth casually, and Earthlings couldn't go to other worlds casually either. Betty Ross listened with great interest to Daniel Joe's description of life in worlds beyond Earth. However, if she were to read the online literature of the East in this era, she would find that what Daniel Joe described were things from those fantasy worlds. This is the Stanley cake shop I told you about. We often come here to buy cakes. The cakes here are delicious, and you'll definitely be coming here often in the future. Betty Ross pushed open the door and greeted the busy owner inside. Hey, Stan, I brought you a long-term customer today. How are you going to thank me? Betty Ross is a very cheerful and simple girl, but she is also very sensitive inside. She often keeps everything bottled up, preferring to get hurt herself rather than hurt others. This is why Betty Ross is loved by many people, even the owner of this shop. This was an elderly man with white hair and some balding, and he looked somewhat like an older Einstein. However, for some reason, Stan seemed to have some opinion of Daniel Joe. He looked at Betty Ross somewhat angrily and said, "Is this your new boyfriend? Why didn't you introduce me?" Stan knew about Dr. Bruce Banner. He didn't originally open his shop in this area. It was only after Betty Ross lost her memory that General Ross forcibly requested him to move to New York, across from Imperial University. It was more of a threat than a request. Although Betty Ross had lost her memories of Dr. Banner, she had a deep impression of the Stanley cake shop. She even used the words, "they," when talking about it before, referring to her and Dr. Bruce Banner. So, after Betty Ross woke up, she directly told General Ross that she wanted to eat cakes from Stanley's. At that time, the psychiatrist suggested to General Ross that he find a way for Betty Ross to be able to eat Stanley's cakes whenever she wanted, using familiar things to stabilize her emotions. In fact, Betty Ross's ex-boyfriend whom she had just broken up with was a top psychiatrist. It's unknown whether General Ross had a hand in this. Therefore, Stan's attitude towards Daniel Joe today was not because he was Betty Ross's new boyfriend. After all, in the years since Dr. Bruce Banner was gone, Betty Ross hadn't only had one boyfriend. Actually, Dr. Bruce Banner had been hiding in the Stanley cake shop these days, and then using the opportunity of delivering cakes to go to the biological science laboratory at Imperial University to look up some information, and at the same time discuss his condition with another top biological scientist he met online named Mr. Blue. It was precisely because Dr. Bruce Banner was here that Stan felt uncomfortable when he saw Betty Ross bring a new boyfriend here again. He had originally hoped to see Dr. Bruce Banner and Betty Ross get back together, but Betty Ross had found a new boyfriend. This couldn't be blamed on Betty Ross. Stan knew very well that Betty Ross had already lost all her memories of Dr. Bruce Banner, so his anger could only be directed at Daniel Joe. Daniel Joe didn't mind at all. He was still in the stage of quickly integrating into this world, not only trying to create a new account on Facebook but also improving his past social circles. After all, in the future, there would definitely be investigations by S.H.I.E.L.D. and Hydra. So having an old man who was a little angry with him was actually a good thing. However, if it were Daniel Joe's usual temper, if someone were to inexplicably confront him as soon as they met, Daniel Joe would definitely teach them a lesson. Although Daniel Joe's actual age was not young, in a simple and fixed environment like Jotunheim, time kept repeating, and everything felt like yesterday. Therefore, Daniel Joe's psychological age was actually not old, at most around 27 or 28 years old. His name is Daniel Joe, a new friend I've made. Betty Ross knew that Daniel Joe was pretending to be a freshman in the biology science department at Imperial University. As a professor in the biology science department, how could she introduce him to others? "Hello, Stan, you can just call me Daniel." Daniel Joe greeted Stan with a smile. Stan sighed deeply, and then could only say stubbornly and helplessly, "There are no other cakes right now. You either wait a little longer or take this Italian strawberry cake. Everything you make is the best." Betty Ross nodded in agreement and also acted spoiled with a laugh. Old Stan could only smile helplessly and start packing the cake. But just then, a voice suddenly came from the back kitchen, "Stan, today." As he spoke, the back kitchen door opened, and Dr. Bruce Banner, who had just taken off his cake delivery uniform, poked out half of his body. He immediately saw Betty Ross standing opposite Stan, and Betty Ross also saw Dr. Bruce Banner immediately. She was completely stunned. After Betty Ross lost her memory, to be honest, she had seen photos of Dr. Bruce Banner more than once. She had even looked through Dr. Banner's information in front of Daniel Joe, but she had never recognized him, not even once. But today, upon seeing Dr. Bruce Banner in person, the lost and forgotten memories in her mind surged out like a tide in an instant. Her face immediately changed, and she couldn't help but stand up, looking at where Dr. Bruce Banner had disappeared, and rushed out like a madwoman, with a look of dullness and pain. Daniel Joe exhaled softly, looked at old Stan with a sneer, and then followed him out directly. To be honest, if old Stan had stopped him earlier, as long as his voice was a little louder, Dr. Bruce Banner wouldn't have rushed out from inside. It was obvious that he still hoped that the two of them could get back together, which is why he didn't stop Dr. Bruce Banner from walking in directly. However, nothing was that simple. In Daniel Joe's opinion, old Stan's actions this time not only didn't help but instead pushed everything to a point that no one wanted to see. And soon, the most tragic scene would appear before the world. When Daniel Joe chased out the back door of the cake shop, Betty Ross was looking around everywhere, but at this time, in the alley of the back street, Dr. Bruce Banner had disappeared. When she saw Daniel Joe following closely behind, Betty Ross suddenly turned around and looked at Daniel Joe coldly, questioning him unceremoniously, "Did you know about this all along, that I lost my memory? It seems you've completely remembered." Daniel Joe nodded and said, "Yes, at first I just thought you were someone with the same name, but after I saw the photo of you and General Ross, I knew you were that Betty Ross. But what could I do? You yourself had already lost your memory of Dr. Banner at that time, and it was post-traumatic amnesia. I think you should know exactly what happened." Hearing Daniel Joe say this, a trace of pain flashed across Betty Ross's face. No one knew better than her why she had lost her memories of Dr. Bruce Banner. At that time, after Dr. Bruce Banner successfully completed the experiment, he turned into the completely uncontrollable Hulk, smashing, looting, burning, and doing everything imaginable. In order to stop him, countless American soldiers died at his hands, and even Betty Ross herself and General Ross were seriously injured. General Ross, as a soldier, was in a slightly better condition, but Betty Ross was directly beaten to the point of lying in a hospital bed for a month without regaining consciousness, almost becoming a vegetable. Finally, she managed to wake up, but she had lost all memories of Dr. Banner. And in General Ross's opinion, this was not necessarily a bad thing. So he took this opportunity to specifically find a professional psychiatrist to help Betty Ross solidify her forgetting, and even acted as her boyfriend, staying by her side for several years. "Then why didn't you wake me up?" At this moment, Betty Ross displayed an incredibly sharp attitude. She could tell at a glance that Daniel Joe, who could discover her condition, could naturally resolve her problems. "That's a strange question. We just met a few days ago, and I don't know Dr. Bruce Banner at all. Besides, he hasn't been heard from at all these years. How could I be sure what your relationship is? And mental problems are very complex. Don't think that just because you've recovered your memory now, it's necessarily a good thing." Daniel Joe shook his head, looking at Betty Ross with a hint of worry. "Do you really think that mental trauma is that easy to heal? If it heals slowly and naturally, there probably won't be a big problem, but if her memory is awakened so suddenly and roughly, at best she will start forgetting things frequently later on, and at worst she will develop senile dementia, mental confusion, and even a shortened lifespan and sudden death in old age. All of this is very possible. I don't care about all that, I need to find him now." Betty Ross put on an unreasonable stance. But at this moment, Daniel Joe waved his hand indifferently and said, "You shouldn't be looking for me about this matter. You should be looking for the person inside. He is the one who knows his whereabouts best, and I suggest you hurry up. Your father has been having people watch you since 2 days ago." When Daniel first returned to Earth, he indeed didn't find any surveillance personnel around Betty Ross, and it wasn't until a few days later that people started appearing around, and their target wasn't Daniel. However, Daniel knew in his heart that even without deliberately investigating him, an investigation into his identity and origins was unavoidable. But he didn't care much about this. With their methods, even if S.H.I.E.L.D. came to investigate now, it would be impossible to uncover Daniel's identity issues. Daniel understood this very clearly the moment he received his acceptance letter. This showed that at least in the Netherlands, everything from top to bottom had been arranged within just a few days, and they had even sorted things out with Imperial University in America. This indicated that at least within the senior ranks of Imperial University, they had their people. Of course, these were all Daniel's own matters. Now, seeing Bruce Banner appear, Daniel finally understood the whole reason. General Ross was certain that Bruce Banner had returned to America, which was why he sent people to watch his daughter. He was sure that after Bruce Banner returned to America, he would definitely come to find Betty Ross, even if it was just to take a look. However, at this time, even being watched by her own father, Betty Ross couldn't care about so much anymore. She quickly rushed back into the cake shop and eagerly questioned old Stan, the owner. Daniel followed in without haste, because at this moment, he knew best that Bruce Banner hadn't gone far at all, hiding in a secret location nearby. He just didn't want to come out and see Betty Ross, and Daniel didn't expose this. Old Stan himself had the intention of getting Betty Ross and Bruce Banner back together. Under Betty Ross's urgent questioning, Old Stan finally, reluctantly, gave her Bruce Banner's contact information, and Betty Ross chased after him without a second thought. Seeing that Daniel was still in the shop, Old Stan asked with a slight surprise, "Aren't you going to chase after her?" "Why would I chase after her? From that moment on, I have no relationship with her anymore." Daniel didn't know if he was being heartless or genuinely didn't care. He pointed to the cake on the side and reached out, saying, "My cake, I already paid for it before." Although Old Stan was full of doubts, he still brought over the strawberry cake Daniel ordered. Just as Daniel was walking to the door with the cake, he suddenly stopped, turned his head, and said to Old Stan, "You'd best notify the two of them that General Ross has sent people to follow." Hearing Daniel say that, Old Stan's face instantly turned extremely grim. He knew that Betty Ross was likely being watched by General Ross's people, yet he still let her go find Bruce Banner. If General Ross were to lead people to chase after them because of this, the situation would be unimaginable. He immediately couldn't help but pick up the phone and dial. Daniel didn't know what the situation would be like afterwards, and he wasn't in the mood to care now. Was he supposed to watch Betty Ross and Dr. Banner being intimate? After all, no matter what, he still had a certain intimate relationship with Betty Ross. And just as Daniel said, his relationship with Betty Ross had completely ended at that moment. There was no deep affection between them anyway, just like normal urban men and women. So, after Daniel said those words, everything Betty Ross did afterwards had nothing to do with him, nor was it her cheating on him. Rather, to be blunt, it was he who had been cheating on Dr. Banner. Given Dr. Banner's current physical condition, even if he and Betty Ross were intimate, nothing further could happen. Betty Ross herself surely had first-hand experience of this. Once the Hulk was stimulated to appear, no one could control the subsequent situation. Daniel didn't bother with all that. He carried his suitcase in one hand and the cake in the other, walking towards the East Village, 2 blocks away. The apartment the Netherlands bought for him was in the East Village, very close to Imperial University, less than a 20-minute walk. Daniel had been staying at Imperial University collecting data for the past few days, so he hadn't had the time to pay attention to other things, nor had he gone to see the apartment bought for him. Now that things here were settled, it was a good time to move. Daniel originally thought the apartment bought for him was a unit in a building, but when he arrived, he found it was an entire townhouse, one of a row of identical 3-story villas along the street. Daniel's was one of them. However, these townhouses looked like they had been around for some time. The typical American red brick exterior walls were somewhat aged, and the internal and external wiring was dense. If it weren't for the neat appearance, it wouldn't be much different from the older communities in his home country. Daniel took the number on the key and walked directly to a villa slightly further inside. However, after stopping, he was a bit confused because he could see several obvious bullet holes on the exterior wall of the villa in front of him, and there was still a police car parked in front of the neighbor's door on the right. Daniel had some very bad associations for a moment. No wonder they could acquire such a townhouse so quickly and at not a very high price. Indeed, it's happy America, gunfights every day. Regardless, the house had been bought. What needed to be done next was to slowly repair it, and also see what the situation was like inside the house. Just as Daniel opened the door and was about to go in, the door of the next door neighbor's house also opened simultaneously. Daniel paused briefly and looked over, wanting to understand the situation next door. He saw a middle-aged police officer in a white uniform come out, and at the same time, a girl's voice came from inside the room, "Dad, you forgot your bag." "All right, hurry back inside." The middle-aged police officer took the bag and nodded at Daniel. It was clear he had seen Daniel's appearance. The smile on his face was very kind and friendly, and he didn't intend to say much more. As the door closed, he also turned and walked towards the police car at the door. Daniel now generally understood what was going on. His next-door neighbors were police officers, and someone probably sought revenge on the police, resulting in the current state. The neighbors next door were likely scared, which was why they were eager to sell the house quickly, and these people happened to acquire it. After all, the location was good, the price wasn't expensive, and they needed to sell urgently, which suited everyone. Opening the door and walking in, the house was covered in dark red patterned wallpaper, looking a bit gloomy. After Daniel turned on the lights, everything inside the house looked better. He could tell that the furniture, light fixtures, and everything else in the room looked very old. So, although this area had a good location, it actually couldn't sell for a high price, as buying the house would still require money for renovations. But that was also good. A complete renovation would allow him to do some special designs and ultimately suit his preferences better. The previous owners left in a hurry and left a lot of things behind, even the refrigerator wasn't emptied. Daniel just needed to throw away and replace some things, get a batch of new ones, and he could move in directly. As for renovations, he would have to find people from outside. It was quite a cleanup. Just as Daniel finished cleaning up, took a quick shower, and was about to enjoy the cake he bought, there was a knock on the door. It was the neighbor next door, the neighbor's daughter, a pretty blonde girl, not old, holding a plate of cherries. As soon as Daniel opened the door, the girl said with a smile, "Hello, I'm your neighbor. I saw you cleaning up just now. Are you moving in?" "Yes." Daniel was relatively calmer and explained, "I just moved in today. I'll be renovating again in a few days, so I'll be bothering you." "It's all right, it's always nice to meet new neighbors. Here, this is a gift from us." The girl handed the cherries in her hand to Daniel and smiled sweetly, "My name is Gwen Stacy, you can just call me Gwen. I got into Imperial University this summer." "I say, girl, are you silly? Is it really okay to say so much to a stranger?" Daniel couldn't help but inwardly complain. "But wait, Gwen Stacy, Gwen, girl, are you sure you're not Mary Jane?" Daniel managed to squeeze out a smile. While taking the cherries from Gwen, he said, "What a coincidence, I'm also a new student at Imperial University this year. Classes start in a few days. Imperial University has 4 semesters a year, 1 each quarter, followed by a vacation of over 20 days. In the 3rd year of high school, you can apply to join the university each semester and report for classes each semester." Daniel chose to report at the end of June or early July. "You're also a new student at Imperial University." A look of confusion appeared on Gwen Stacy's face, because although Daniel looked very young, his eyes gave people a feeling of having gone through a lot. She originally thought he was much older than her, but there were also older new students. Gwen didn't feel comfortable asking Daniel's real age. Instead, she changed the subject and said, "Aren't you taking more vacation days to rest?" "Rest for what? How can resting be as interesting as studying?" Daniel put on the air of a top student, shook his head, and then extended a hand, saying, "Oh, I haven't introduced myself yet. My name is Daniel Joe, and I'm from the Netherlands." "You're Dutch." Gwen Stacy shook hands with Daniel, finally understanding roughly why Daniel was enrolling so quickly. Now that he had arrived in New York, although there were no major issues, having the identity of an Imperial University student would allow him to integrate into the city more quickly. As the daughter of a police chief, Gwen Stacy's understanding of certain things far exceeded that of ordinary people her age. People have attributes. No matter when, a label will be attached to you, and people with the same label will gather together for warmth. And in reality, you will subconsciously use this label to leverage the power of the group, whether it's a school, fellow townsman, or the same profession. The power of the group will always far exceed the power of the individual. Daniel and Gwen Stacy had just met and couldn't talk too much, so Daniel quickly closed the door and returned to his room, but at this moment, his face was extremely grim. Betty Ross, Gwen Stacy, these are all people who left deep marks in the original Marvel history. If Daniel encountering Betty Ross and thus meeting Dr. Bruce Banner could be considered luck, then his subsequent encounter with Gwen Stacy could not but make one suspect that someone was manipulating all of this in the dark. But who could manipulate Daniel in such a way? Odin. There is no one else but Odin. This kind of silent ability, unnoticed by anyone, only Odin, the Allfather of the Nine Realms, possesses such power and such ability to manipulate fate. Daniel was already grinding his teeth in hatred at this moment. He wondered why it was such a coincidence. First Betty Ross, and now Gwen Stacy. Through the two of them, it also involved Bruce Banner and Spider-Man Peter Parker, and even more superheroes. What did Odin want to do? Daniel hated this feeling of everything being out of his control the most. Back then, he could even get the Cosmic Cube a step earlier than Red Skull, but because he knew that whoever got the Cosmic Cube would always be under Heimdall's surveillance, he temporarily gave up on the Cosmic Cube. But ironically, after World War II ended, when he was preparing to temporarily take the Cosmic Cube, he was suddenly tricked by Heimdall, who used the Cosmic Cube to teleport him to Jotunheim. But now, he was being targeted again, this time not by Heimdall, but by Odin. What exactly does this guy Odin want to do? Chapter 11. The matter involved Odin, and even though Jo Young was full of confidence, he still couldn't help but feel a little anxious. If things were really as he thought, then Jo Young's every move in the future would likely be within Odin's calculations, unless he could wait until the day Ragnarok arrived, wait for Odin to die, and only then could he try his best to break free from Odin's control. Don't think it's over just because Odin is dead. As one of the few Skyfather-level powerhouses in the entire Marvel Universe, even when he was alive, extremely old, so old that he had to frequently enter the God King's sleep for recovery, Odin still suppressed Thanos, Death, and others, preventing them from acting rashly. So even if Odin dies, his influence on fate will still continue for a long time. Therefore, if Jo Young wants to break free from Odin's control, his own strength must be raised to a considerably strong level, and the sooner he wants to break free from Odin's control, the faster his strength must improve. Sitting at the dark red tea table, Jo Young held a white teacup in one hand. Although he wasn't deliberately using force, tiny, almost invisible cracks had already appeared on the teacup. This shows how deeply this matter affected Jo Young. He had always tried to break free from the control of others, but the more he struggled, the more firmly he was held in their grasp. Resistance was still necessary, but he absolutely could not expose his true strength. He had to make others misjudge his capabilities. Odin, Jo Young always felt that no matter how he improved his strength, he would always be under Odin's control. Therefore, to completely break free from Odin's control, he either had to wait for him to die, or he could only rely on external forces, such as the Infinity Stones. Thinking of the Infinity Stones, Jo Young finally relaxed a little, gently exhaled, and continued to think. Now that he had encountered Betty Ross and Gwen Stacy, he might encounter Black Widow Natasha, or even characters like Captain Marvel tomorrow. These matters were essentially not within Jo Young's own control, so he had to be prepared. Odin wanted to use Jo Young in one of two ways. Either have him assist Thor and help Thor grow, or have him be Thor's enemy, becoming a whetstone on his path to growth. Although Jo Young's strength certainly couldn't bear such a heavy responsibility, don't forget this is Earth. Whether it's Thor or Loki, after they arrive on Earth, their own strength will drop by a level, which greatly narrows the gap in their power. If he were to become Thor's helper, offering advice by Thor's side, and even helping him deal with some enemies, Jo Young himself would be willing to do such things. However, Jo Young's own identity was a big problem. He had a feeling that no matter how close he got to the people from the Avengers, as long as his identity was exposed, none of them would let him go. Therefore, Jo Young could only be on the opposite side of Thor. Even if he was unwilling, the Odin would push him in that direction step by step. Moreover, a whetstone is just a whetstone after all. One day, when Thor no longer needed Jo Young as a whetstone, he would very likely be completely destroyed. This day was very likely to become a reality in the future. Therefore, Jo Young either had to grow strong enough in the future to be on equal footing with Thor, or he had to find a way to leave Earth. Only the vast deep space universe could allow Jo Young to roam safely. Although Asgard's 9 realms were vast, when it came to the vast universe, they were just a small part of it. Especially after Odin's death, even if Thor eventually defeated Thanos, his strength still couldn't compare to Odin's. As long as he could get the Infinity Stones, no matter what, he would have the qualifications to be on equal footing with Thor. In the end, everything still came down to the Infinity Stones. And now, Thor would arrive on Earth in just a few years. As soon as Thor arrived, Loki would follow closely behind. After that would be the Chitauri invasion of Earth, and the struggle for the Infinity Stones would then kick off. Indeed, due to his identity issues, Jo Young could easily end up on the opposite side of the superheroes. However, this world wasn't entirely ruled by superheroes. The true dominant power in this world lay with the governments of various countries, and those who controlled those governments were cunning and treacherous politicians. They had no distinction between good and evil. As long as someone could be used by them, even if Mephisto came, they would say he was a good person. And now, an opportunity that could allow Jo Young to get closer to government forces was right in front of him, General Ross. Facing the powerful Hulk, there were very few people on Earth who could be his opponent, and it was the same even if Jo Young intervened. It was just that after he intervened, General Ross's defeat would become slightly more decent, and this slight decency could change many things. Regardless, given his own situation, he needed to prepare several layers of identity consecutively. Even if one of his identities was exposed, he didn't want this identity to affect his other identities. What Odin could influence was, after all, only the overall picture of fate, but on the detailed level, it still depended on Jo Young himself to operate. Details could truly change the overall picture. Furthermore, if Odin could truly control fate, then Asgard's Ragnarok would not have arrived. There was still a chance, it was just that the specific operations required more caution and care. After thinking for a whole night, Jo Young finally had a general understanding of the situation he was facing. So, for now, he needed to start with General Ross and approach the United States military. Didn't the United States military always want to create their own supernatural group? Well, Jo Young would give them that opportunity now. Although Betty Ross and Dr. Bruce Banner hid very secretly that night, they still revealed their whereabouts the next day. This could be detected from the fact that Jo Young was intentionally or unintentionally driven away as soon as he entered the Imperial University campus. On the surface, Jo Young left the Imperial University campus with most people, but quietly, he had already used invisibility to sneak back in. Invisibility was not the exclusive patent of Kamatage sorcerers, and there were many ways to cast invisibility. The simplest way was to use optical illusions to cast the most basic invisibility. Slightly stronger methods could use optical methods to cast illusions, while the strongest method was to hide oneself in spatial cracks by using spatial folding. This was the method used by the people of Kamatage. As for Jo Young, he used a method of deep optical invisibility, which was more profound than the invisibility techniques of Japanese ninja, but the most fundamental principles were similar. Regardless, Jo Young had entered the campus. At this time, the campus was already filled with more than a dozen tanks and various special weapons prepared for the Hulk. General Ross did not initiate the attack the moment he discovered the Hulk. Instead, he first deployed all the pre-prepared arrangements targeting the Hulk, and then very decisively launched the attack in the busy campus. Dr. Banner and Betty Ross had just walked out of the Biological Sciences building. What they took was all the data Betty Ross had copied during that experiment back then, and only this data could help Dr. Banner recover his self to the greatest extent. But they never expected that they had just returned to campus when more than a dozen tanks surrounded them from all directions. And surrounding those tanks were squad after squad of American soldiers. While quickly evacuating the crowd, they were also rapidly approaching the two. And it was at this moment that Betty Ross saw her own father, the gray-haired but cold-faced General Ross. Deputy Director Ross sat in the largest command vehicle, his expression cold and stern. Through the communicator in his hand, he directed team after team of Special Forces soldiers to surround Bruce Banner from all directions. Alongside him, tanks, armored vehicles, and various other pieces of equipment with unclear purposes were loaded onto vehicles and rapidly approached the two people's location. Having dealt with Bruce Banner and Hulk for so long, Deputy Director Ross had a thorough understanding of them. This time, to deal with Hulk, he even borrowed two special pieces of equipment from Stark Industries, specifically for the purpose of confronting Hulk. As a standard military politician, Deputy Director Ross had invested too much energy in Bruce Banner. The failures of those overseas operations could be covered up by his ability, and could even conversely become evidence of Hulk's power. But when operating on native soil, he had to ensure success as much as possible, while minimizing the harm Bruce Banner caused to ordinary people. Putting aside everything else, if Imperial University were to suffer too much damage, then even without the Imperial University president speaking, the alumni who graduated from Imperial University in Congress alone would be enough to make Deputy Director Ross look utterly disgraced. So, even though countless American soldiers had already stormed into the campus, and tanks had also rolled into the campus, up to this point, no one had fired a single shot or shell indiscriminately. Everything was still within a controllable range. Go, you must go quickly. Betty Ross showed a rare decisiveness at this moment. She pushed Bruce Banner abruptly, then immediately rushed towards her father's location, even spreading her arms to block the armored command vehicle. The armored command vehicle was full of soldiers. Although they knew the person blocking their way was Deputy Director Ross's daughter, without Deputy Director Ross's order, no one dared to stop the vehicle. Even if it meant running directly over Betty Ross, they could only do so. General, Betty Ross spread her arms, her eyes fixed on Deputy Director Ross in the command vehicle as she pleaded hoarsely, "Stop it, please, let him go, Dad." In the military, even Betty Ross could probably only address Deputy Director Ross as General. He was very rigid in this regard. But at this moment, Betty Ross could only call out his other identity. "Stop." Deputy Director Ross finally let out a deep sigh and issued the order to stop at the last moment. Betty Ross was just that close, that tiny bit away, from being completely run over by the command vehicle. Deputy Director Ross kicked open the car door and jumped out, but he didn't even glance at his own daughter. His eyes immediately surveyed the layout of the entire battlefield. That's right, Imperial University campus had now become the battlefield between Deputy Director Ross and Hulk. "Dad, please don't do this." Betty Ross still quickly blocked her father's path. No one in this world knew him better than her. Wherever his eyes looked, she knew what he intended to do. "You don't see the situation clearly at all, Betty. Is this something we can stop just by saying so?" A hint of a bitter smile flashed across Deputy Director Ross's face, but more prominent were his extreme coldness and cruelty. Indeed, everything now was no longer something he could stop just by saying he wanted to stop. Mobilizing so many troops on the soil of New York required at least an emergency mobilization order issued by the mayor of New York City or the governor of New York. But Deputy Director Ross was not familiar with either of them, so he went through the White House. Hulk's appearance in New York had deeply threatened the safety of the entire United States. New York was practically a stone's throw away from Washington. If a terrifying powerhouse like Hulk were to break into Washington, the consequences would be absolutely catastrophic. Therefore, it must be completely resolved in New York before that happens. At the very least, such an explanation would satisfy Congress, and New York City and New York State wouldn't say much either. Precisely because so much force had been mobilized, he could not easily stop. Otherwise, seeing no threat or disaster, Deputy Director Ross himself would have to bear the heavy responsibility of unilaterally mobilizing the army, which would directly end his entire military career. However, on the other hand, if Dr. Bruce Banner was willing to surrender, Deputy Director Ross might very well accept. But the question is, would Dr. Banner surrender? No, he wouldn't. Dr. Banner was very clear about what Deputy Director Ross wanted to do after capturing him. He really didn't want to see such an army of super soldiers, modified from his blood, appear in this world. Such an uncontrollable, terrifying army would be a devastating threat to the entire world. Therefore, the conflict between the two was fundamentally opposed and irreconcilable. Take her inside. Deputy Director Ross knew very well that no matter how he communicated with Betty Ross at this moment, it wouldn't solve the entire problem, and it would even delay his plan to capture Banner. Or rather, his clever daughter appearing before him was for this very purpose. "No, Dad, General. Betty Ross was being grabbed by the two soldiers and pushed towards the armored command vehicle. She struggled fiercely, while also pleading with Deputy Director Ross to change his mind, but it was all in vain. However, at this moment, the communicator nearby rang. "General, he's on the library skybridge." At this time, Bruce Banner had run from the library onto the skybridge, and then directly ran towards another building of the library. After passing through that building, there was a large grassy plaza behind it, surrounded by trees and bushes. Running further west, past the outermost fence of Imperial University, and across the road outside, was the Hudson River. At that point, Dr. Banner could immediately use the Hudson River to escape. In fact, Deputy Director Ross hadn't been back in New York for long, not even a day. Before that, he had been chasing Bruce Banner in Brazil, but somehow, Banner had escaped. If he hadn't finally discovered that Banner had been fleeing north all along, Deputy Director Ross would never have suspected that Bruce Banner had returned to the United States. That's why he started sending people to monitor Betty Ross. However, even within the entire United States, there were too many places Bruce Banner could go. There was their secret base in the Nevada desert back then, the initial research base at Culver University, and also his daughter Betty Ross. But the moment Bruce Banner was discovered, Deputy Director Ross had already formulated a very strict encirclement plan with the Department of Defense staff. In a short period, he even contacted Stark to borrow 2 highly targeted pieces of equipment, and even the Army's tanks were quietly mobilized here. This shows how strong Deputy Director Ross's capabilities were within the entire United States military. Joe Young did not reveal himself easily. It was not his time to act yet. But at this moment, he had already sensed several people paying attention to the situation, such as Daniel Drum, the master from Kamatage. Although they did not easily participate in secular affairs, it did not mean they weren't paying attention. Of course, there was also Spider-Man standing on a tall building in the distance. Peter Parker's senses were very strong, and don't forget, he also enrolled in Imperial University this year. Originally, he should have been wandering around Manhattan, but he saw this scene. If there hadn't been so many soldiers, tanks, and cannons, Peter Parker might have already rushed over. But precisely because the United States military was involved, he didn't act rashly, because he knew that the United States military was completely different from the police on the streets. They were far more cold-blooded. In addition, there was Iron Man Stark hiding hundreds of meters up in the sky. Deputy Director Ross had made it clear who he was dealing with when borrowing the equipment, so Stark naturally paid much attention to the operation of his own devices. Like Spider-Man, if ordinary civilians were likely to be harmed here, Tony Stark would definitely be unable to resist intervening. But the United States military and the monster created by the United States military, well, forget it. He didn't have the leisure for that. Besides them, many others were also watching this scene. Professor Charles from the Mutant Academy, and the famous Fantastic Four in New York. Such a large movement by the United States military was hard to escape their notice. However, like others, they would not easily interfere in the United States military's operations. If they were facing ordinary people and police, their intervention might earn them some gratitude, but against the United States military, if they rashly intervened without the military's consent, then even if they were helping, the military would attack them without hesitation. Furthermore, there were people in the White House and the Department of Defense monitoring the area via remote satellite. Of course, this included Nick Fury of S.H.I.E.L.D. Despite not knowing exactly how many people were watching or where they were hiding, Deputy Director Ross had long been prepared for all of this. Block him on the skybridge. Deputy Director Ross certainly didn't want to easily see Dr. Banner escape. Under his command, his soldiers had already arrived ahead of time outside the doors of the buildings on both sides of the skybridge, holding firearms and firmly blocking the entrances. At this moment, Deputy Director Ross's orders continued. Do not shoot, do not go inside, do not have any contact with him. Lock him inside. As Deputy Director Ross's orders were issued, the soldiers on both sides had already firmly locked the doors on both sides with chains. Simultaneously, countless gun muzzles and cannon barrels were aimed at Bruce Banner. Close-range infantry shock troopers, snipers hidden in the distance with large-caliber sniper rifles, and tanks and armored vehicles surrounding everything tightly on the periphery. They were all targeting Dr. Banner. At this moment, Deputy Director Ross was very calm. He knew that even if all the tanks and armored vehicles fired in unison, they might not be able to kill Hulk. And he hadn't come here today to use these powerful equipment. What he wanted to do more was to use some targeted equipment to find a way to capture Hulk alive. Although killing Hulk would provide them with a massive amount of experimental samples from his body, that amount would be finite. Just like the super soldier serum modified from Captain America Rogers' remaining blood, there wasn't much left now. Therefore, they needed a live Hulk even more, one who could continuously provide them with blood samples, allowing them to transform all the soldiers in the entire United States into super soldiers. Fire 2 tear gas canisters. Deputy Director Ross issued the order very carefully and cautiously. Beside him, Betty Ross, in this suffocating environment, also subconsciously remained silent, knowing that 2 tear gas canisters could not kill Bruce Banner. Earlier, upon discovering Bruce Banner's whereabouts, Betty Ross had already forcibly broken free from the soldiers who wanted to escort her to the armored command vehicle. Now, as the situation became increasingly serious, the soldiers' attention was no longer on her. Boom, boom, 2 tear gas canisters were shot into the skybridge in the blink of an eye. White mist quickly spread throughout the skybridge. In an extremely short time, people could no longer see what was happening inside the skybridge, and they heard sounds of painful roars gradually lowering. Slowly, all sounds ceased completely, and then with a bang, a colossal green hand slammed heavily against the skybridge's glass. Everyone's heart felt as if it had been fiercely squeezed by that giant green hand in an instant. Immediately following, a 3-meter-tall dark shadow flickered indistinctly within the white mist, and then with a boom, half of the skybridge was violently smashed away. A colossal green beast leapt directly from the skybridge. The ordinary soldiers around instinctively ran into the distance, getting as far away as possible from this crazed and ferocious beast. At this moment, Betty Ross also saw the true face of this ferocious beast clearly. This beast standing there, growling continuously, still showed traces of Bruce Banner's face. However, this was vastly different from his initial transformation into Hulk. Although he was still wild and fierce back then, one could at least see his struggle. But now, there was nothing left. As a PhD in biological sciences, Betty Ross was very clear that everything was changing in an irreversible direction. Looking at the raging and roaring Hulk standing there with a ferocious face, Jo Young then looked at Betty Ross on the other side, her eyes wide, her face full of disbelief, and the last glimmer of hope in her heart completely extinguished. Jo Young couldn't help but exclaim, "General Ross truly has good methods." Everything was proceeding according to their original plan. Even if Betty Ross appeared in the middle, it didn't matter much to General Ross. He even directly used the original plan to let Betty Ross see the true face of the Hulk clearly. Good methods, good methods. Let alone Jo Young, even an ordinary person could see the drastic psychological changes Betty Ross was currently undergoing. The current situation wasn't a bad thing for Jo Young. However, based on his understanding of Betty Ross, if he wanted Betty Ross to completely give up on Bruce Banner, the current scene was far from enough to reach that point. Women are always emotional, just like they always think they can guide a Sea King back to the right path. So as long as the Hulk shows a hint of human characteristics, Betty Ross will, in turn, support him even more firmly, even more crazily. Jo Young was hidden in the shadows, carefully observing the battle that was about to unfold. On one side was the rampaging Hulk with immense power, whose strength would even grow infinitely with his anger. On the other side was the United States military, using as many modern weapons as possible. The battle between them would be very helpful for Jo Young in positioning his own strength and dealing with similar encirclements in the future. After all, he had been away from this world for decades. Although he knew in his heart that modern weapons had developed to a considerably powerful level, he had never had a practical experience. Now, with the comparison between the Hulk and the well-prepared General Ross, Jo Young would be more confident when facing the United States military in the future. The two sides quickly began to act. The Hulk's fierce and terrifying appearance had already scared some American soldiers into retreating continuously. One timid soldier who had never seen this scene before was so scared he didn't know what he had touched and fell directly to the ground, his assault rifle firing involuntarily. Tat tat tat. The American soldiers on the front line all instinctively pulled the trigger, and a storm of frantic bullets rained down on the Hulk. Seeing this scene, General Ross simply and decisively issued the order, "Alpha Team, attack." General Ross did not immediately order tanks and artillery to bombard. That was a last resort, and it could only drive the Hulk away, not kill him completely. Not to mention, his purpose this time was to capture the Hulk alive. The Alpha team, which had already set up their pre-arranged positions, immediately began full-scale firing. They were a considerable distance from the Hulk and were all concentrated on the south side. The bullets from the assault rifles in their hands caused the Hulk more pain than the bullets fired by other soldiers. Under these circumstances, the Hulk was forced to flee north, and in the jungle further north, a row of special equipment had already been prepared. But the Hulk did not flee directly north as General Ross and his men expected. It was a subconscious deviation. Although the angle of deviation was small, it prevented the prepared equipment from exerting its maximum effect. "Where's the 50mm autocannon? It's your turn." With General Ross's order, an armored vehicle equipped with a 50mm caliber autocannon shot out from behind the armored command vehicle, quickly chasing towards the Hulk's location. In a very short time, it caught up to the left side of the Hulk's body, firing frantically at him while forcing him to shift towards the northeast, continuously approaching the preset direction. It hurt, it really hurt. Countless bullets hit the Hulk's body. Although they didn't break his skin, they caused him immense pain, and at the same time, immense anger arose. Suddenly, the Hulk stomped heavily on the ground, and using the powerful rebound force, he slammed hard into the assault armored vehicle next to him, sending it rolling violently away. However, whether it was due to the design of the armored vehicle or sheer luck, after rolling several times, the armored vehicle eventually came to a steady stop on the ground. At this moment, the Hulk seemed to sense something. He no longer continued to advance north, but instead rushed more frantically towards the west, attempting to break out of the campus and escape into the Hudson River. However, the entire campus was already filled with United States military personnel. Suddenly, a team of American soldiers rushed out from the nearby jungle and unceremoniously pulled the trigger on the Hulk. But at this moment, the Hulk couldn't care less about so many things. He charged directly forward, wanting to deal with this team of American soldiers and then rush into the Hudson River to the west. From this, it can be seen that although the Hulk appeared very fierce and brutal, he was not stupid. However, just at this moment, a sharp stinging pain suddenly came from behind. It was the assault armored vehicle that he had knocked over earlier, which had rushed back and was even pressed tightly against the Hulk's back, continuously firing at him. This time, the Hulk was truly completely enraged. He suddenly jumped backward and sideways, leaping over 5 meters in one go. He immediately jumped to the side of that assault armored vehicle. With his thick green hands, he directly grabbed the rapidly moving assault armored vehicle, then held it and swung it towards the American soldiers not far away. Although several American soldiers managed to escape in time, more were directly smashed into a pulp by this strike. The bloody scene appeared before Betty Ross's eyes just like that. Even she hadn't expected things to develop to this point. Casualties had already occurred, and it was even more impossible for the American side to stop. However, all of this was not over yet. The Hulk had already seen more American soldiers appearing to the southwest. Without thinking, he directly grabbed the armored vehicle in his hand and smashed it fiercely towards that direction. After continuously smashing down several American soldiers, the armored vehicle directly crashed into several transport vehicles. The immense power directly pushed those transport vehicles horizontally across the ground for over 10 meters, creating an extremely terrifying scene. This was no longer an enemy that humans could contend with. Fear had already appeared in the eyes of many American soldiers. Don't look at United States soldiers as very powerful, claiming to dominate the world and so on. But fundamentally, United States soldiers are just mercenaries. Once there are huge casualties, they are more likely to simply collapse. How could General Ross not see this point? So he simply used another method. "Blonsky, it's your turn." "Understood, General." From the crowd in the southern jungle that had been forcing the Hulk to flee north, an American major who was not tall walked out. He threw away the assault rifle in his hand, then took a small handheld grenade launcher from another American soldier and pulled the trigger on the Hulk. The 2 special grenades that successively hit and exploded on him caused the Hulk intense pain. Even his skin was slightly cut open, and blood had already seeped out, forcing the Hulk to reach out and pick up the assault armored vehicle doors that had fallen on the ground earlier to use as cover, preventing similar grenades from hitting him again. It was Blonsky's moment of glory. He moved like lightning, continuously firing grenades from the launcher in his hand. Some landed directly behind him, some were even smashed between the 2 car doors by the Hulk, but no matter what, the power of the explosions did not harm the Hulk at all. Unconsciously, Blonsky had already rushed in front of the Hulk. He slightly adjusted the angle of the grenade launcher in his hand, and with a bang, a grenade flew over the two car doors in the Hulk's hands and smashed hard onto his chest. The immense force almost knocked the Hulk directly to the ground. At the same time, Blonsky had fiercely charged forward. He placed one foot on the Hulk's knee, directly stepping on his body to jump up. His left knee directly hit the Hulk's jaw, and then he fiercely stomped on his throat again. With just that one blow, the Hulk was sent staggering back several steps by the powerful force and finally sat down on the ground. And Blonsky's attack still didn't stop. The ammunition in the grenade launcher in his hand had been used up, so he simply pulled out his pistol and aimed at the Hulk's eyes, ears, nose, and other vital points, firing frantically. Even someone as powerful as the Hulk, if hit in the eye by a bullet, it might be difficult for the bullet to penetrate into his brain through the eye, but it would definitely blind him. The Hulk is undoubtedly powerful. Such small tricks, if the strength difference between the two people is not large, could indeed pose some threat. However, although Blonsky has undergone some physical modification, the increase in his own strength is relatively limited, especially when compared to the Hulk. The Hulk could even just close his eyes tightly and slightly turn his face. Even if Blonsky's bullets hit his eyelids, it would be difficult for them to penetrate his eyelids and hit his eyes. The Hulk's defensive power was just that abnormal. And in Zhou Yang's opinion, Blonsky's current physical capabilities were not much different from Captain America Rogers when he first underwent the super soldier modification. He had personally seen Rogers transform from a thin soldier into a super soldier with immense strength and superhuman speed back then. However, as time gradually passed, the power of the super soldier serum gradually became apparent, and Captain America Rogers also became stronger. But Blonsky was different. He used the super soldier serum modified from the blood left behind by Captain America Rogers. Although he possessed power similar to what Captain America Rogers had when the incident occurred, his overall potential was limited. Not to mention, Captain America Rogers also had a Captain America's shield in his hand, which was the fundamental reason for the substantial change in Rogers' overall combat power. However, in any case, to some extent, Blonsky's super soldier modification was successful. At the very least, he survived. If this operation continues, the United States military will soon have a batch of super soldiers like Blonsky. It just depends on how much of this super soldier serum the United States military still has in their hands. However, there shouldn't be too much. Over the years, the United States military and the American government have conducted countless similar experiments, both internally and externally. Not only the United States military, but also a large number of military-industrial enterprises, and even some private security companies, have more or less obtained some super soldier serum, leading to a sharp decrease in the stock of super soldier serum. Therefore, the further into the future, the higher the value of each dose of super soldier serum, and it becomes very difficult to use. Moreover, with such an investment, it would be better to use it on military equipment. To be frank, the investment in all the military equipment currently seen here combined might not be as high as the cost of conducting a single super soldier experiment. With this effort, it would be more convenient to just build 2 more F-22s. Blonsky's ability was more on the level of flexibility. He was like a nimble monkey. The Hulk was swinging 2 huge car doors in his hands and couldn't hit him at all, which made General Ross in the distance quite satisfied. However, things couldn't continue like this. General Ross immediately gave Blonsky a remote order: lure him to the sonic cannons. The sonic cannons were powerful weapons borrowed by General Ross specifically from Stark Industries. Just borrowing this item for one day cost money like flowing water, not to mention that if these 2 sonic cannons had problems, the price General Ross would have to pay would be even greater. Although Blonsky was having fun, he was also under great pressure. Despite his extreme flexibility, he could also best appreciate the Hulk's power. It could be said that if he were hit just once by the large iron doors in the Hulk's hands, he would immediately be smashed into a pulp. So, as soon as he received the order, without needing to think much, Blonsky immediately ran towards the distant jungle. His speed was really fast, even a car might not be able to catch up to him, but the Hulk was chasing closely behind him, refusing to let go. In just over 10 seconds, Blonsky was already finding it difficult to bear. He felt that if he continued like this, he would be smashed into pieces by the Hulk before he could even reach the preset position. "Don't mind me, prepare to attack," Blonsky roared loudly towards the distance. And just at this moment, 2 trucks carrying sonic cannons rushed out directly from the hidden jungle. The soldiers quickly ran to the control panels of the sonic cannons and activated them in a very short time. And just at this moment, Zhou Yang, who had been hiding in the shadows, finally became serious. After 2 chapters of slacking off, it had finally reached the most exciting part. Blonsky was blown away instantly, but his position was slightly off, and the 2 sonic cannons were not targeting him. So after Blonsky was blown away diagonally, everyone's eyes fell on the Hulk behind him. The powerful sonic impact hit the Hulk directly. The 2 sonic cannons immediately unleashed their maximum power. You could even see waves of formed circular attack air currents generated in the air, which were exceptionally conspicuous. Zhou Yang's heart couldn't help but tighten at this moment, because he knew that the speed of these sonic cannons had already broken through the sound barrier, which was why they caused such a noticeable effect. Just seeing this scene, he couldn't help but feel a chill all over his body. And seeing the Hulk's predicament, he felt even more terrified. The Hulk's power is beyond doubt, and with each increase in anger, the later stage Hulk could even stand toe-to-toe with Thanos in a one-on-one fight. However, the scene before him completely shocked Zhou Yang and also made him more determined to borrow the power of the United States military. He saw that the Hulk, who had been running forward, stopped instantly when he was hit by the super strong shockwave, and even couldn't stop his feet from constantly retreating. He persisted in using the 2 car doors in his hands to shield his eyes, but even so, his entire body constantly rippled like water. His body's muscles and bones at this moment seemed to no longer be like a whole, as if every inch of muscle wanted to break free from the control of his bones at this moment. The toughness of the Hulk's muscles is well known, but in the face of the powerful sonic cannons, his own body felt as if it didn't belong to him at all, and this was just the beginning. The 2 car doors in his hands were blown away in the blink of an eye, and the horror had just begun. In an instant, he saw the Hulk couldn't help but cover his ears in pain. His head kept shaking back and forth, and his mouth wanted to let out a scream of intense pain, but all sounds were instantly drowned out. Even his eyes began to turn red at this moment. The hardness of all human body tissues is different. Muscles, bones, internal organs, eyeballs, and the brain, these things have completely different tolerance levels. And now, the super-intensity high-frequency sound waves are simultaneously acting on the Hulk's skin, bones, internal organs, eyeballs, eardrums, and even his brain and heart. Moreover, according to their own nature, the reactions produced by these things in an instant are also different. Zhou Yang stood far away, but he could clearly see that the Hulk's eyes were completely bloodshot, and even seemed about to pop out of his eye sockets. From this, one could imagine the violent impact his own heart and brain were enduring. Zhou Yang put himself in the Hulk's shoes. If he encountered an attack of such power, especially when caught off guard suddenly, the time he could withstand it would be much shorter than the Hulk's. However, what he could do was not stand still and constantly resist like the Hulk, but rather use this opportunity to borrow this force to be blown away far away. Only by staying away from the sonic cannons could he reduce the damage this weapon inflicted on him. But if the opponent had endless means, then even he himself would probably find it difficult to avoid being captured or killed. In his mind, such a scene couldn't help but flash, and he instinctively shivered. Therefore, the United States military with such technological power is still the most powerful, and Tony Stark is also the most difficult to mess with. So don't think that he usually only uses the arc reactor to propel energy particles to destroy enemies. That's because that method is the most direct, but when it comes to other methods, he is not lacking at all. Therefore, if the United States military stands against him, what Zhou Yang needs to do is to destroy all modern instruments and equipment within his spiritual sensing range at the very first moment of confrontation. The range covered by his own spiritual power far exceeds the effective attack range of the United States military's weapons. And as long as the distance is widened, the means the United States military can use will be very few, unless it is like now, being lured into a preset battlefield. In large cities, Zhou Yang cannot guarantee that his spiritual power is fully open at all times, nor can he constantly destroy all modern equipment around him. Therefore, he must be careful not to be led alone into an empty square. As long as he is in a large crowd, even the United States military would not dare to easily use such highly destructive weapons. After all, they still have to consider public opinion. At this moment, Zhou Yang had a full understanding of the technological power of this world. Just the things in front of him, if they were to strike first, then even Jo Young could only end up in a tragic state or be killed, not to mention that the opponent still had nuclear missiles that hadn't been used. So even someone as powerful as Iron Man, if the United States military were truly determined to deal with him, then as long as they detonate a nuclear bomb in midair while he is flying at high altitude, Stark would probably be completely annihilated. However, dealing with Stark is not that easy. Even if you don't mention his own hacking abilities, the artificial intelligence life he created, Jarvis, can infiltrate the missiles in the shortest time, change their trajectory, or detonate them in advance. This is very useful for Jo Young to learn from, so in the future, it is best for him to have a high-tech company. What this high-tech company needs to be able to do is to influence the missiles flying in midair, or rather, influence the internal circuits of all networked instruments and equipment in the entire world, causing them to self-destruct and be unable to launch any attacks. Jo Young's magic can also do this, but relatively speaking, the range his magic can affect is very short, but it is already enough. The magic wand in Jo Young's hand rotated gently, but no magic fluctuations were emitted, because he knew that as long as he was willing, the magic he could unleash could destroy the various circuits operating inside those two sonic cannons instantly, rendering them completely ineffective. At this point, Jo Young finally breathed a sigh of relief. Compared to those who rely solely on their physical bodies for close combat, these magicians still have some advantages, especially in modern society. The more powerful the weapon, the more precise the operation required, and by simply controlling some key parts, these weapons can be completely nullified. However, no matter what, a high-tech company must be opened. At the very least, he can use the high-tech company to collect the internal designs of all the precise modern weapons owned by the United States military, so that when he encounters them, he can destroy them in the shortest possible time. Wiping the cold sweat from his forehead, Jo Young, who had figured everything out, looked at the Hulk who was still holding on in the field. He had no intention of intervening, because he knew that the Hulk didn't need his help at all. The Hulk is the biggest monster in this world. The more you attack him, the angrier he gets, and the angrier he gets, the stronger he becomes. Indeed, under the powerful attack, the increasingly pained and angry Hulk began to gradually regain his footing, but unfortunately, no one except Jo Young noticed this. Blonsky, who was blown away and lay on the ground covering his ears, watched the Hulk's miserable state from afar, a look of smug mockery on his face. General Ross, standing at the very back, also breathed a sigh of relief at this moment, but just then, Betty Ross, seeing the Hulk so miserable, couldn't help but rush towards General Ross. She grabbed General Ross tightly, her voice low, pleading in extreme pain, "Dad, please let him go, you're going to kill him if you keep this up." General Ross's face was cold, and he shook off his daughter's plea. At the same time, two soldiers followed closely and tightly restrained Betty Ross. At this moment, Betty Ross, disheartened and completely helpless, could only look at the Hulk, who had been hit by the sonic cannons, with a pained expression. However, at this moment, she suddenly found that the Hulk in the distance was also looking at her, and in his eyes, there was a look that reassured her. Betty Ross was somewhat disbelieving for a moment, widening her eyes. And under the gaze of countless people, the Hulk forcefully plunged his hands into the ground, and then, under the attack of the powerful sonic cannons, he climbed off the two car doors on the ground step by step, and stood up amidst everyone's incredulous stares. With a loud boom, an entire transport vehicle, along with the sonic cannon mounted on it, was instantly flattened by the giant iron door thrown by the Hulk, and then exploded with a roar. The huge fireball caused the wide-eyed onlookers to involuntarily close their eyes slightly. At this moment, the power of the sonic cannon had been reduced by half. The remaining sonic cannon simply could not restrain the even more powerful Hulk. A huge shadow fell, and the entire sonic cannon was directly crushed by the Hulk. Seeing this scene, Jo Young couldn't help but nod. The high-tech power possessed by the United States military, and even the entire human world, is indeed not to be underestimated, but this high-tech power also has its weaknesses. Their own materials determine this point. The weapons of these countries on Earth are ultimately limited by their materials. Unless they can swallow the entire Wakanda and use all of Wakanda's vibranium to build weapons, only then can they dominate the Earth. However, that is only dominating the Earth. In the entire universe, there are many weapons that can destroy an entire planet with a single blow. If all humans are destroyed, even if some high-tech weapons remain, they are meaningless. However, occupying the entire Wakanda and using all of their vibranium to build high-tech weapons, or perhaps magic weapons, is not an impossible path for Joe Young. The flashes of inspiration that crossed his mind were all memorized by Joe Young, but his attention was focused more on the battlefield, on General Ross and the others. As the Hulk became angrier and stronger, perhaps the time for Joe Young to act would come soon. As expected of a professional soldier, even when faced with this sudden change, General Ross reacted immediately. He immediately issued an order, saying, attack helicopters, sortie immediately. Everyone prepare to retreat, retreat. Deputy Director Ross knew very well that it would not be easy to capture the Hulk today. All the targeted measures he had prepared had failed. Therefore, to deal with the Hulk, unless he chose to fire tanks recklessly in the campus, he could only find a way to force him away. Force him in a specific direction, towards an open area far from the city, so that he could be dealt with using more powerful high-tech weapons. Or he could swallow some pride and directly ask Stark for help. General Ross was still very clear-headed. He knew that if he were to fire recklessly at Imperial University, a battle could very likely end up destroying the entire Imperial University. One must know that this is Manhattan. Afterwards, even if he could successfully capture the Hulk, the crazy politicians would push all the responsibility onto him, and even the final disposal rights for the Hulk would be directly stripped away. Attack helicopters were the most powerful force he could openly deploy. As for the tanks and armored vehicles, they were actually just light tanks, existing as a deterrent force. Their actual combat effectiveness was far less than their deterrent effect. General Ross had to admit that, at least for today's encirclement, he had almost failed. To capture the Hulk alive in the future, he would need to use more powerful weapons, which would require further communication with Stark. Betty Ross, who was standing nearby, also heard General Ross's retreat order. At this moment, she also breathed a sigh of relief. Similarly, the Hulk was just standing there, roaring angrily, with no intention of continuing to attack. Just as the situation seemed to be gradually calming down, a figure suddenly charged violently in front of the Hulk. This person, holding a tactical dagger, was none other than Blonsky. Blonsky, of course, heard General Ross's order and understood his subsequent plan, but at this moment, Blonsky was simply unwilling to accept it. How could he accept it? He had finally become so powerful, how could he tolerate failing directly in front of the Hulk? Blonsky rushed towards the Hulk but suddenly stopped, not continuing his attack. His expression was very complicated. Finally, he raised his head, looked at the Hulk, who was almost twice his size, looked at the fierce-faced Hulk, who had calmed down somewhat after venting, and said with a scornful sneer, "Is that all? Blonsky, retreat, now." General Ross's tone was heavy. Blonsky's actions now completely violated his orders. However, General Ross didn't have many options now, because although Blonsky was wearing an American uniform, he was actually a member of the NATO command. He was British, and although General Ross had seconded him to carry out orders, he actually had no authority over his personnel disposition. And it was clear now that Blonsky was somewhat unwilling to carry out General Ross's orders. He had begun to question his decisions. So Blonsky directly removed the earpiece from his ear. On the surface, he looked relaxed, but his entire body was already completely on guard. With a face still full of mockery, he said to the Hulk, "Is that all you can do?" A fierce look flashed in the Hulk's eyes. The next moment, his right foot suddenly lifted and kicked forward like lightning. Immediately after, before everyone's eyes, Blonsky was kicked directly 50 or 60 meters away without any resistance, and then collapsed there like a pile of mud. Even Joe Young, standing far away, could see that all the bones in his body had been shattered by that kick. The anger in the Hulk's heart was ignited again. At this moment, General Ross, who was most familiar with the Hulk, continued to issue orders, "Everyone, retreat, retreat immediately." Having fought the Hulk so many times, General Ross knew very well that when the Hulk is angry, the best way to calm him down is to not have any enemy who attacked him appear before his eyes. This is the best way to minimize losses. However, not everyone was aware of this characteristic of the Hulk, and not everyone would follow General Ross's order to retreat, such as his daughter, Betty Ross. When General Ross issued the retreat order, the other soldiers who were originally controlling her had already released her and chosen to retreat themselves, while she herself kept her eyes fixed on the Hulk in the center of the battlefield, walking towards him step by step. Due to the obstruction of vehicles, General Ross did not notice Betty Ross walking towards the Hulk immediately. He was thinking about giving orders to the armed helicopters, fire immediately, fire quickly. No matter what, the Hulk standing there was always a fatal threat, so when he couldn't be dealt with, luring him into the Hudson River was also an option. This was written down in their initial contingency plans. So when General Ross saw Betty Ross standing in front of the Hulk, the armed helicopters flying over had already pulled the trigger. Countless bullets rained down from high altitude, hitting the ground and creating one deep pit after another. Betty Ross, who had originally intended to wake up Bruce Banner, was instantly extremely flustered. She subconsciously lunged towards the Hulk, but in her panic, she stumbled and fell to the ground. Seeing Betty Ross fall to the ground, the Hulk subconsciously lunged towards her, wanting to use his body to protect her from the bullets. But at this moment, the Hulk suddenly felt an invisible barrier appear before him. The next moment, a figure had appeared beside Betty Ross, directly picking her up amidst the hail of bullets, and then quickly retreating. This person was none other than Joe Young. "Stop firing." General Ross had just shouted the order when he saw Joe Young quickly leaving with Betty Ross in his arms. He looked in disbelief as countless bullets hit Joe Young's back but were blocked as if by some barrier, unable to harm him at all. With a loud boom, it was the Hulk who threw the other large iron door in his hand, hitting the armed helicopter in midair. The armed helicopter exploded instantly, turning into a fireball that crashed towards the ground, and their target was none other than Joe Young, who was holding Betty Ross on the ground. Just as Joe Young suddenly stopped his retreat, he pointed the magic wand in his hand at the fireball in midair. The next moment, it was as if an incredibly sharp invisible blade appeared in midair, instantly cutting the huge fireball formed by the exploding armed helicopter in half, and then directly smashing towards the earth from both sides of Joe Young's body. Countless sheets of iron pieces, and various steel components, after hitting the ground, immediately shot out in all directions at extreme speed. However, when they landed on Joe Young, they seemed to encounter an invisible obstacle and could not injure him in the slightest. The debris of the armed helicopter that exploded a second time upon hitting the ground, not only the fragments, but also the strong shockwaves they caused, and even the intense flames, were blocked by this invisible shield. And the one who did all this was Joe Young, standing there holding the magic wand. This invisible barrier not only protected Joe Young but also protected Betty Ross, whom he held in his arms. Perhaps because the scene before her had completely terrified her, Betty Ross offered no resistance to being held by Joe Young. The countless fragments constantly flying around, along with the intense flames billowing up, had already scared her into shrinking tightly into Joe Young's embrace. At this moment, Betty Ross's mind was completely blank, but smelling the familiar scent on Joe Young still made her feel very safe. After all, Joe Young was not a stranger to her. Betty Ross knew very well that Joe Young was a powerful magician. And during the days they spent together, they also discussed many things related to magic. Betty Ross only regretted that she couldn't become a magician herself, otherwise she could do much more. After her memory recovered, Betty Ross finally understood why she wanted to learn more about magic. In the end, it was still for Bruce Banner. Although she had completely forgotten him for several years, deep down, the desire to help him solve his problems had become an instinct. However, after regaining her memory, she felt the difficulty of their relationship. Especially today, upon seeing the mighty Hulk, Betty Ross knew in her heart that it would be difficult for them to go back to the past. The Hulk, who was closest, saw all this clearly. He originally wanted to rush over, but the propeller of the armed helicopter that had just exploded directly spun towards him. With that momentum, even if it hit a high-strength concrete wall, it could cut it in half, let alone a human body. Facing the power of such a cross-shaped propeller, even the strong Hulk subconsciously dodged to the side, but he kept a constant watch on Betty Ross's situation not far away, and also saw the extraordinary power displayed by Joe Young. The Hulk might not be familiar with Joe Young, but Bruce Banner knew him, and even secretly monitored him for several days because of Betty Ross. But perhaps even Bruce Banner didn't expect Joe Young to have this kind of ability. Equally astonished was Deputy Director Ross, standing in the distance. When he noticed that his daughter was not by his side but standing opposite the Hulk, it was already too late. The bullets fired by the armed helicopter were raining down like a storm, and his daughter Betty was caught in the downpour. "Betty!" Deputy Director Ross's painful cry had just left his mouth when he saw a figure appear in front of his daughter Betty. Countless bullets hit his body, as if encountering an invisible barrier, completely unable to penetrate. Deputy Director Ross only found out about Jo Young 2 or 3 days ago. Since the Hulk had disappeared for several years, his daughter Betty's mental state had completely stabilized over the years, and she had long since completely forgotten the existence of Bruce Banner. Therefore, the people he had arranged to protect and monitor her had gradually been withdrawn, and now there was no need to pay any attention. After all, his daughter Betty was also a smart girl. If she discovered that he was secretly monitoring and protecting her, it would only further damage the fragile father-daughter relationship. In today's urban life, especially in a world-class metropolis like New York, it is not uncommon at all for people to sleep together within half a day of meeting. In fact, it has almost become the norm. Then, they go their separate ways the next day. If it goes well, they might continue to contact each other for a few days, but if not, they never see each other again. Regardless, Deputy Director Ross had to investigate every man who appeared around his daughter, especially at this time. Fortunately, there was a buffer period of 1 or 2 days in between, and Jo Young had completely arranged his identity properly, so even if Deputy Director Ross investigated, he would not find anything unusual. He only had a slight suspicion about Jo Young's identity as a 19-year-old college student, but this current scene made him understand even more that deeper secrets were hidden behind Jo Young. However, now was not the time to pursue all this. He was also very surprised by Jo Young's sudden appearance, because according to what old Stan said last night, Jo Young had completely broken off his relationship with his daughter yesterday noon due to the appearance of the Hulk, but it seemed that it was not so easy to let go. The huge fireball directly fell from midair towards Jo Young and his daughter Betty's heads. Deputy Director Ross's heart was in his throat. But when the magic wand in Jo Young's hand suddenly split the entire fireball in half, his eyes narrowed slightly. The fireball fell to the ground and exploded directly. The huge flames completely engulfed Jo Young and Betty Ross, but at this moment, Deputy Director Ross was no longer so worried. If Jo Young was truly a magician, how much could he utilize from this? Although Deputy Director Ross was a soldier, he was a true politician among soldiers, even a very successful military politician. In a very short time, he completely cast aside that fragile father-daughter affection, and now he was more focused on the power that Jo Young could exert. Deputy Director Ross was not unfamiliar with magicians. As a senior general in the United States military, especially a top general involved in the supernatural realm, Deputy Director Ross knew many things, whether it was the witches in Massachusetts, the mysterious wizards in the South American jungle, or the legendary mage Merlin in England, and even the magicians of Kamataj, he knew a little about them. But things like magicians are not something you can deal with just because you want to. They are too well hidden. Even if you use the entire America intelligence system, it is difficult to find their whereabouts. If you can't find the person, even having a nuclear bomb is meaningless. Moreover, magicians are not as easy to manufacture as super soldiers. Even without personally contacting magicians, just from the fantasy novels circulating on the market, one can know that becoming a powerful magician requires not only very top-level aptitude but also years of cultivation away from the secular world. This is unacceptable to the government and the United States military, which are eager for quick results. It is better to study mutants and super soldiers than to spend time on magicians. However, this does not mean that magicians are useless. The power that a powerful magician can exert on the battlefield is simply too strong. This can be seen from some secret archive records from World War I and World War II. If he could be recruited. Deputy Director Ross thought a lot. Although his position in the United States military was very high now, he was not the only one who had achieved results in the supernatural field. Colonel Stryker had several successfully created mutants in his hands. S.H.I.E.L.D. had also recruited several people with special abilities, not to mention that hateful and lovable Stark, and countless more secret super soldier experiments that were ongoing in the dark. In an extremely short time, Deputy Director Ross, who saw Jo Young save Betty Ross, had countless thoughts flash through his mind in an instant. The surging flames only lasted for an extremely short time. When the firelight dissipated, Jo Young, holding Betty Ross, appeared unharmed in the eyes of more people. But in Jo Young's eyes at this moment, there was only the Hulk, who was close at hand. The wreckage of the armed helicopters lay scattered on the ground, the burning flames seemingly causing a chain reaction. Drops of rain began to fall from the sky, gradually increasing in intensity. The rain falling on the burning helicopter wreckage actually caused more black smoke. For some unknown reason, Hulk looked at Betty Ross, who was held in Zhou Yang's arms, and subconsciously took a step forward. It was this step that caused the magic wand in Zhou Yang's hand to point directly at him. With magic power rapidly circulating, countless raindrops formed a flowing barrier in front of Zhou Yang, directly blocking him and Hulk. This barrier became increasingly distinct, eventually forming a solid ice wall. Hulk's view of Betty Ross was completely blocked. For some reason, a strong sense of unwillingness rose in Hulk's heart. He clenched his fists, letting out a fierce roar at Zhou Yang's indistinct voice behind the ice wall, and took an attacking stance. And at that moment, Zhou Yang, behind the ice wall, also reacted. He spun the magic wand in his hand towards the raindrops in midair. In an instant, countless raindrops quickly gathered, ultimately forming one white ice cone after another, each about 30 centimeters long. Countless white ice cones spun rapidly above Zhou Yang's head, forming a high-speed ice cone vortex, and their target was none other than Hulk on the other side of the ice wall. Moreover, as time passed, more and more ice cones appeared above Zhou Yang's head. A continuously rising cloud of ice cones appeared before everyone's eyes, and also gradually spread towards Hulk's location. Everyone who saw this miraculous scene couldn't help but widen their eyes. They had a premonition that if things continued this way, it wouldn't be long before this suddenly appearing figure would clash head-on with Hulk. The anger in Hulk's heart grew stronger, especially when hundreds of thick, spinning ice cones appeared above his head. He sensed a huge threat. He bent his legs slightly, and just as he was about to make a move, he suddenly felt his feet slip, almost losing his footing. It was then that he suddenly realized the ground beneath his feet had been frozen solid with a layer of ice at some point, and the ice layer was extremely smooth. Not only that, a chilling cold that his body could hardly bear simultaneously came from his feet, causing a barely perceptible lack of coordination in Hulk's body for a moment. Besides his feet, there was also the area above his head. Some of the rain above was rapidly condensing into more sharp ice cones, while more rain was also falling directly onto Hulk's body. However, compared to before, the rain falling on him was now getting colder and colder. For a moment, Hulk felt that he was not facing a single Zhou Yang, but as if the entire world was against him. "Put me down," Betty Ross's voice came from behind the ice wall, momentarily clearing Hulk's mind. Immediately after, Hulk's gaze fell on General Ross standing in the distance, as well as the tanks and armored vehicles beside him, whose cannons were all aimed at him. Feeling a strange pang of pain in his heart, the next moment, Hulk no longer hesitated. Without even looking at Betty Ross, he bent his legs, stomped hard, and in the blink of an eye, he leapt away into the distance, disappearing in an instant. As Hulk left, the ice cones above Zhou Yang also formed a 5-meter wide river of ice, chasing closely after Hulk, flying directly towards the Hudson River. After Hulk jumped into the Hudson River and escaped, that river of ice cones also fell into the Hudson River and then disappeared. Zhou Yang also disappeared. The exceptionally spectacular river of ice cones had attracted everyone's attention. By the time everyone's attention returned, Zhou Yang was no longer standing where he had been, leaving only Betty Ross. The father and daughter stood in the heavy rain, facing each other from a distance. Facing her usually dominant father, Betty Ross showed no sign of backing down. Finally, General Ross could only let out a long sigh. His daughter had a good life, even better than her mother's life, which had already passed. Regarding Zhou Yang, General Ross did not rashly visit him. He wanted to re-examine all the information about Zhou Yang, and at the same time, learn more about him from his daughter Betty Ross's mouth, to see what kind of existence he truly was. Betty Ross did not just have the campus apartment as a residence, she also owned a small villa in the Upper East Side. At this time, the entire villa was already filled with countless American soldiers. Under General Ross's command, they were searching for all information related to Dr. Bruce Banner's secret experiments. General Ross was very clear that Zhou Yang might be able to help, but only to a limited extent. Dr. Bruce Banner, or rather Hulk, was the sole factor for him to build a super soldier army. However, at this moment, General Ross was carefully reading the information about Zhou Yang. From his birth in the Netherlands, through kindergarten, elementary school, middle school, high school, and even his studies at Imperial University, including the assessments by Imperial University professors, all the information was very detailed. But General Ross was very clear that this information was just the surface, there was more hidden beneath the surface. As a military politician, General Ross considered the gains and losses more. If capturing Zhou Yang could help him cultivate more superpowered individuals, then he would not hesitate to use soldiers to capture him. However, when it comes to studying a magician, whether you plan to dissect him or inject the super soldier serum into his body, it is difficult to uncover more secrets about a magician. That's right, General Ross was indeed considering the possibility of cultivating a team of magicians, but how to force Zhou Yang to comply, how to force him to help cultivate more magicians, or how to control his abilities, how to capture him, based on the information at hand, he simply didn't know where to start. Moreover, Zhou Yang was not necessarily easy to provoke. Unless he could be completely controlled in one go, once action was taken, there would be no room for reconciliation between the two sides. And compared to Hulk, he knew even less about Zhou Yang. General Ross's gaze fell on his daughter Betty. He finally couldn't help but ask, "Betty, how much do you know about him?" Looking at the photo of Zhou Yang in the file, Betty Ross, who had been sitting calmly there, glanced at her father and said expressionlessly, "He is a magician, haven't you already known that? I mean, how did you meet? What is his real purpose for coming to New York? You don't think he came to New York just to study, do you?" General Ross put on the facade of a father concerned about his daughter, but he was inwardly startled, because from what Betty Ross said, it was very clear that she had known for a long time that the other party was a magician and the other party had not deceived her. This ruled out the possibility that the other party was deliberately approaching his daughter. General Ross couldn't help but feel annoyed. Since Stark officially announced that he was Iron Man, more and more similar super-powered individuals have appeared. He hasn't reported today's events to the White House and the Pentagon yet, and there will be trouble. Betty Ross certainly knew what her father was thinking. She snorted disdainfully and said, "Daniel is much harder to catch than Bruce. And someone like him, do you really think he is the only one? What do you mean by that? Are there others behind him?" General Ross suddenly sat up straight, his eyes filled with shock and uncertainty. What Betty Ross said was quite possible. After all, a powerful magician doesn't just appear out of nowhere. This is different from super soldiers. Whether successful or not, one or two can be cultivated casually. A mature magician requires more than 10 years of continuous cultivation. If there is an even more powerful magician standing behind Zhou Yang, then it must be carefully considered. If capture is not possible, then only enticement and co-option remain. In a short time, countless methods flashed through General Ross's mind: money, women, reputation, power. He could give him all of these, as long as he could help him, whether it was cultivating a team of magicians or helping him capture Hulk, it was acceptable. And the key to all of this would fall on his daughter. Looking at his daughter Betty's disdainful expression, a thought couldn't help but rise in General Ross's heart. Perhaps it was time to hand over this problem, Betty, and at the same time, use her to restrain Hulk. Taking a slight breath, General Ross said in a gentle tone, "Betty, I need you to tell me where he is now." The he referred to here was naturally not Zhou Yang, but Hulk, Dr. Bruce Banner. Although Hulk had now disappeared, only Betty Ross knew best where he was most likely to go now. At this moment, Betty Ross simply didn't want to pay attention to her father and turned away, but her gaze gradually became serious. Although she didn't know where Hulk had gone, she knew where Dr. Bruce Banner would go next. No one knows a daughter better than her father. As soon as Betty Ross made a move, General Ross had already judged that she must know clues about Hulk's whereabouts. However, he also knew his daughter best. He certainly wouldn't get anything by asking. But by investigating her past movements and reviewing every piece of information she had looked at in the past, he could always find a little clue. However, although he already had a plan in mind, General Ross did not show it. Instead, he continued to persuade, "You should know how serious the consequences would be if he were allowed to wander around the city alone and lost control. He won't easily hurt others." Betty Ross suddenly turned around and stared intently at General Ross, saying, "If it weren't for you, if it weren't for the appearance of you and your men, then today's events could have been completely avoided. We cannot allow such a huge potential threat to wander freely across America, especially with how close it is to Washington. You should know that this is not just my personal matter." General Ross said a rare truth. Betty Ross also knew this point in her heart, but she knew even better that everything was caused by her father. If you hadn't been chasing him abroad all this time, he wouldn't have been forced to return to the country. That's because we all know, everything is irreversible. General Ross sighed deeply, a hint of weariness and old age showing in his expression. He said in a fatherly tone, Betty, you are not young anymore. I don't want to interfere with your marriage, but I hope you can spend your life with a normal person. But we all know, that person can absolutely not be him. After speaking, General Ross said no more. He took his raincoat from his deputy, glanced at his daughter Betty, and then followed the soldiers who had collected all the information into the rainy night outside. However, after getting into the car, General Ross's expression immediately became serious. 2 things. First, investigate everyone Betty has contacted these past few days, whether by phone, internet, or letter. I want to know everything. Second, quickly investigate everything behind Daniel Joe, especially things that are outside of public view. I want to see who exactly is standing behind him. Although General Ross admitted that Joe Young was valuable, in front of the powerful United States military, no one was their match. It was only because they were currently within the United States. If they were abroad, General Ross's tanks and armored vehicles would have already opened fire without hesitation. He might even have used more powerful weapons, even if not nuclear bombs. The United States military's intercontinental missiles were not to be trifled with. Magicians are indeed powerful and mysterious, but it is well known that their bodies are far less durable than Hulk's. Once hit, even armor-piercing rounds could potentially kill them. Therefore, compared to Hulk, Joe Young is easier to control. However, controlling them is just the first step. Unlike Hulk, who becomes crazy and mindless when he gets angry, magicians are also more cunning and insidious. If things go wrong, the consequences could be even more severe. Therefore, for people like this, it is best to first win them over. If that fails, then threaten them. If threats fail, then only force remains, or direct humanitarian destruction. I hope everyone will support it and subscribe for more videos.